I don't know why it is, but ever since I was, this high, my passion has been realism, also called photorealism. I met my best friend when I was 7 years old in second grade, Rick Parks. He was also an artist, but he was a different kind of artist. He painted what he felt. He was more loose. He could do portraits. He could do anything. And I was very focused on, even back then, the rivet counter sort of thing, getting all the windows in the right place. I love to draw or paint articles of transportation, trains, planes, automobiles, ships, and so forth like that. Transportation I was all about. Spacecraft, spaceships, things like that. And here was my friend Rick, who was doing other things. He was doing scenics and outdoor paintings and splashy things, and he would try to get me to loosen up, paint what I feel. And of course, all through junior high and high school, the same thing. We went through the pop art and the op art phase and all this stuff, and it was so difficult for me to loosen up and just throw things at a canvas and just, you have to paint this scene, but you can only do it in 5 minutes. And it was just like, I can't do that. I can't put all the leaves on the trees in time. It was just very, very difficult for me. So that's always been my direction, photorealism. And that slowly evolved over years into, serious photorealism, where I mean, my high school art teacher was so impactful for me. It's not the right word, but had such an influence on me because his mantra was observation. Paint or draw what's really there. If that's what you're after, draw what's really there. Paint what you're really seeing, not what you think you're seeing. The first thing is the R&D. And I hit the books, I hit the internet, I hit my deck plans, and gather up all the photographs. I've collected archival photographs since I was in high school of Titanic, her sister ships, Olympic and Britannic, from every conceivable angle, mostly exterior views because that's usually what I'm asked to paint. But being asked to paint Titanic over and over again, and being a sort of a perfectionistic sort of person, that makes you an expert eventually over time. I hate that word expert, but I mean, it makes you pay attention. It makes you study these photographs so that the paintings get better and better and more accurate all the time. So it's the R&D that starts it out. When I've got all the ducks in a row and I know I know what I need to know for that particular painting, including backgrounds, weather conditions, tidal situations at certain times of the day, wind direction, all that, you got to study the historical record. And then, depending on whether it's for a book, I'll oftentimes paint on heavy illustration board because it doesn't have the texture of the canvas, and it's easier for the publisher to photograph and reproduce in a book, or if it's on a canvas. And if it's on a canvas, what I do is I turn the canvas over and I actually fill the backside of it with layers of something called foam core so that I can't push the canvas down. I like it to be flat and firm. So I make that a flat, firm board, if you will. I paint flat. I do not use an easel. It's probably not the best thing for my posture, but I'm just comfortable having the board or the canvas down in front of me. I have a flat table that I work on. I also need it to be flat because I'm completely surrounded by these archival photographs throughout the painting process. And I'm often painting through a little tiny hole that I've created with all these photographs lying around. And you'll see a little tiny space that I'm working on for days. Yeah, I start with painting skies and the basic sea colors, the first thing that I do naturally. And I just slowly fill in the thing. And then the ship goes in once the background is basically done. And the last thing to be painted would be the rigging and little tiny nitty details and so forth. I'm not a morning person. I never, ever have been. So I'm more comfortable starting to paint in the early afternoon, mid-afternoon, and sometimes you'll find me at 4 o'clock in the morning still working. I've got an incandescent light over here and a fluorescent light on this side. And the two of them balance together. The fluorescent light is not daylight tubes, but a a soft white and a daylight, and then I've got a bright incandescent light over here, which they're now trying to outlaw, and God help me if they ever outlaw tungsten lights, because I think that's a crime, but that's another whole subject. Some of the paintings that I've done are particularly research intensive, and one of them was a scene that I did for the big juvenile book, Inside the Titanic, I believe. And it's a really close view of the side, the port side of Titanic, looking aft as she's sitting at the White Star Dock on the morning of April 10th, 1912, at berth 44. And then getting the Southwestern Hotel correct in the distance, and there's a time ball on top of the Southwestern Hotel. And I had to learn about time balls. What color was the time ball? It looks dark, but was it black? Was it bright red? So research goes into that, and how did the time ball work? The Southampton skyline, the buildings that were there, the warehouses that were there at that time in April of 1912. And it's a minefield, because you can't take a photo from 1914 or 1916 or 1922 and say, oh, well, there's this building and there's that building. Probably wasn't there in 1912, or there was a good chance it wasn't. So it's telephone poles that are there in April of 1912 and not there in 1916. Different number of wires on between those telephone poles. It's all, if you care, if you're a crazy perfectionist like myself, this is the stuff that keeps you awake at night. It's just crazy. That detail work, that historical accuracy, getting all the rivets in the right place and the details in the right place is what I'm so proud of, and what I'm known for, and why I am approached and asked to do paintings. People point that out. He said, that's why I want you to do this painting, because I want it to be just right. And those are moments that bring me pride and make me happy. Not only hearing that from clients, hearing that appreciation from people, but realizing it myself as I'm doing the painting, that this is something special. It's something new. Nobody's ever done this before. I've taken all of this reference material and coalesced it and incorporated as much of it as I could in this one scene. 99% of the public would never know or care. But for those like myself who do have an appreciation of history, they can look at some of my paintings and just go detail by detail. Another very satisfying and startling aspect of my artwork is the young people and the people who are just 20 years younger than I am, who are not young, they're middle-aged now, who come up to me and say that my artwork was an inspiration to them growing up or in their elementary school, or my mom got me this book when I was 5 years old and it got me all interested in Titanic. It was this painting that you did and this painting that you did, and now you should see the collection that I have, and it inspired me to take up maritime engineering or to go into this or that, career. As Walter Lord inspired me and got the juices flowing and helped me. Maybe I'm doing the same thing for a younger generation, for another group of people who will carry it on in the future. Of 1995. I got word that James Cameron was out in the North Atlantic, and something about filming on the Titanic for a major motion picture, and it was just like unbelievable. And I had done a matte painting for Jim back around 1984, the final scene in the movie, the original, The Terminator. And so I had worked with him just a little bit back then. I knew what a perfectionist he was, what a detail person he was. And I just couldn't even put two and two together. I couldn't believe that this guy, finally a writer-director, was interested in doing a Titanic project, who really, cared about the details. I knew that he would. I'd had experiences with directors before that, and it was not the same thing. So I picked up a phone and I tracked down where Jim Cameron, was operating out of, Lightstorm Entertainment in Santa Monica, California, and picked up a phone and I called up there, and I think I spoke to John Bruno, who was at that time his special effects guy, and I identified myself and I said, Don Lynch and I have written and illustrated a book called Titanic, an Illustrated History just a few years ago. And we would love to work in any way to advise him, to help him. And John Bruno just cut me off and said, oh yes, yeah, Jim knows about the book. He's got the book. There are several copies of that floating around here. And he does want to talk to you guys. And let's set something up. So I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. And within a few weeks, Don Lynch and I were sitting in Jim Cameron's office in Santa Monica and talking about making the incredible blockbuster movie that it became. He told us about the expedition that he had just come back from, shooting scenes on the real wreck down there on Titanic, shooting scenes to be incorporated in the movie. He was hoping that these scenes would come out good enough and interesting enough, tasty enough, that the 20th Century Fox executives would be impressed enough that they would want to fund this idea that he had to make this incredible, vast, blockbuster, epic really is the word, movie. In early 1996, I was formally brought into Lightstorm and worked with the art department there with the set designers and the draftsmen and even some of the wardrobe to get some of the fashions correct. I mean, all of my period material, I had a lot of period magazines, periodicals, and so forth with fashion illustrations, photographs, and all that. So, of course, all of that I put at their disposal. Despite Jim's penchant for wanting everything to be accurate, there were a few obvious inevitable errors. As I said, it was like waging a war. You've got hundreds of construction people and so forth going on, and little things slipped through the cracks, and there are little mistakes and little errors in the miniatures or the sets or the gigantic ship set. And of course, people on the internet have had a field day since then. Oh, this rigging is in the wrong place and this ladder wasn't really there. So that's inevitable. There's no such thing as perfection, period. But there were some things that were done deliberately inaccurately with the sets. And that's kind of interesting. Like, for example, in the dining saloon, the first-class dining saloon, there are little table lamps on all of these tables in this vast dining saloon that he recreated. And he knew it was he knew it was an iffy thing to do. And the first time I went down to the set after those had been installed and everything, he takes me aside right away to apologize and explain about the table lamps on the set. He says, now I know that technically Father Brown's photograph taken at lunchtime doesn't show table lamps on any of but there are no other photographs of Titanic's actual dining saloon, right? And I said, yeah, that's true. He said, okay, but we do have this illustration of Olympic's a la carte restaurant, and there are table lamps on those tables, and there weren't on Olympic in later years. Yeah, he said, so my thinking is, since I need more lights on my actors, if I can put table lamps on there, we can't technically prove that Titanic didn't have table lamps for dinner on the dining saloon tables, right? And I said, okay, I see your logic there. I think it's wrong. He says, I know it's probably wrong, but I got to do it because if I just have the overhead lights, it's like we're in a mess hall. We're sitting in a bus station. I got to get some light. So that was one of the things that he did on purpose. Another one was adding extra deck lights to the deck houses up on boat deck and around the ship. I noticed those right away, after carefully getting every rivet in the right place. What's with all the extra lights? He said, I know, again, I can't just have the blue light from the night sun. I got to have more lights. We've done tests and it works better if I'm got to put more lights on the deck houses. So darn. Of course, being a perfectionist that I was, this was just tearing my heart out, things like this. And, so there were a few things that were done consciously, call it, movie license, artistic license. Experiencing the set down there in Mexico, both the interior sets and the exterior ship set, was an absolutely inexplicable, indescribable experience that I will treasure for the rest of my life. You stopped thinking of it as a set so quickly, and we just all referred to it as the ship. You know, in between filming, okay, there's 2 hours break now, they're all going to lunch or dinner. I'm going on board the ship, who wants to come? And we'd go up and just walk around. It was this gigantic playhouse, if you will, for a Titanic historian, buff, rivet counter. You forgot so quickly that it was a movie set. It was so detailed, and there was so much, detail there that had been incorporated into the set. And you learned so much about what they did that night and what they went through and why people reacted the way they did to certain things, because we were reenacting it. It was like these light bulbs were going off all the time about things. For example, the ship, when it was disassembled during the Christmas break between 96 and 97, and then re-erected at a 6-degree angle for the sinking sequences that were to come during the next several months. It was amazing how quickly we got used to that 6-degree angle. You would think that, I mean, you look at it and it's really this angle. And yet, after walking around on the decks for just a few minutes, you forgot that the thing was angled. Now, why is that important? It leads right into the fact that passengers were not all that concerned at first. The ship's not going to really sink. Well, you think, well, how could that have been at, 1:15 in the morning? Look at the angle the ship would have been at. Well, this gave us this real-time trial experience of what it's like to be on a ship that's at 6 degrees. And you got remarkably used to it and didn't notice the angle after a while. And another thing was the lifeboat davits. The ones that were built for the movie set were made by the same company that built the original davits for Olympic and Titanic, the Welland Company. For insurance reasons, they had to beef them up for the movie production. The original davits were pretty thin and pretty spindly, so they made them extra thick and extra strong, and they didn't look exactly like the original davits. But the way they worked and most of the details were just really good recreations. And despite their extra strength and stiffness, when these lifeboats were launched, you would see the top of those davits going like this as they were cranking, letting the ropes out. And so the davits would go like this and like this. And Jim said, I thought they were going to tear right out of the deck. Now those are with the extra beefy 1996 davits. You can imagine what the 1912 davits were like and how much they must have moved and how nervous that must have made passengers on the deck watching those lifeboats be launched. One more clear and obvious reason why people were hesitant to get into the lifeboats. Even though I haven't specifically read any accounts from passengers, from survivors saying, and you should have seen the top of those davits. They were wiggling back and forth. I've never read any account to that effect, but they must have. They had to have, because ours were really scary. Working on the movie, or the big movie as I call it, it was a watershed chapter in my life. There's just no question about it. There was before the movie and there was after the movie. I learned a lot from walking the sets, from walking the ship. I learned just so much more about the detail of the structure from helping the miniature people at Digital Domain and helping the crew there try to put all the little nitty things on the miniatures to make them as accurate as possible. But mostly, the thing I value most about that whole movie experience is my relationship with Jim, I have to say. I mean, it led to so many other projects after that. And my friendship with Jim. I had only known him as a cool sort of business distant thing before that. I'd never known him personally. And throughout the movie experience, I got to know him personally. And after that, in 2001, went out with him to dive Titanic again, to explore the wreck on, I think, a dozen different dives. And even today, I'm working with Jim. He's having me do a little bit of work with his miniatures that he built for Titanic, which have suffered a little bit of damage through the years and all the transportation and the exhibits that they've been displayed at through the years. And he called me in to supervise making some restorations to those models to bring them back to the way they originally looked for filming. So it never stops. I mean, invited to his 60th birthday party. We're friends now, and that to me is the most important thing. It's hard for me to imagine that almost 20 years have passed since Jim Cameron's Titanic was released. And it makes me think back to all the different memories that I've retained from working on the project, from working with Jim, the highlights, the lowlights. Any project like that is going to be fraught with frustrations. But I remember the exciting moments, the things that really impressed me the most. And it started off really with my helping the art department with all of my reference material, photographs and research pictures I had collected since the late 60s, and objects from Olympic that I had also collected, actual pieces of woodwork that were carved by the very same hands that worked on Titanic. And I was very fortunate to acquire a wrought iron and gilt bronze baluster from Olympic that ended up being surplus all of a sudden in England. And I was lucky enough to step right in and make that purchase and get that for my collection as well. So now we had an exact section of the balustrade for the grand staircase from which we could make molds to make the staircase perfect for the movie set. It's one of my greatest thrills and my greatest satisfactions is how wonderful the grand staircase set turned out, largely because of those pieces from Olympic that we could actually make casts from. Other pieces in my collection were light fixtures from Olympic, for example. I've got a couple of beaded crystal chandeliers that were in the staircase entrance areas, just exactly like the one that Bob Ballard first photographed in 1986 by using his ROV Jason Jr. And so we were able to make castings from that and make exact reproductions for the movie set. Also, I've got a couple of the octagonal ceiling fixtures from the reception room, also used in the dining saloon. Now, by the 1920s, they had changed the glass in Olympic. It was a different kind of glass, but the gilt brass frame is identical to what was in Titanic. So again, they got wonderful molds from that, and we reproduced those perfectly for the movie. So those were sources of incredible satisfaction for me. The White Star dock set down in Mexico was another thing that I never anticipated in the beginning that would be made so accurate. I was so focused on the ship and the interiors of the ship naturally and so forth, and I provided all kinds of reference material for the way the sheds looked on the White Star dock in 1912, berth 44. And then it was sort of out of my hands, and the guys down in Mexico did their own thing. And the first time I went down there in October of 96, and here was this White Star dock shed, largely completed as I recall, and it was every bit as impressive as the ship itself. I mean, it was you felt as if you had stepped out of a time machine and you were standing there on the dock. One of the features that I was really proud of too was the large bollards that are fitted to the edge of that quay of that dock. And these are great big things. They're made by Thornycroft back then. Back in the late 80s, I had gone to England with a friend of mine, and we'd done a lot of research. And back in those days, you could freely walk around the old White Star dock, or what became afterwards the Ocean Dock. That's where Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth pulled in and had long years of service. And here are these original bollards that were fitted there when these new docks were built in 1909, 1910. Still there, still in use today. And in the late 80s, this is typical of me. I can't help myself. I never know when a project is going to come along and I might need this information. So here I was measuring. I had a measuring tape with me and I was measuring this bollard to the nth degree, photographing it from every angle. I found the one that had the most well-preserved Thornycroft stamping in the base of it. I photographed that, did a tracing of that, not knowing that it would ever be used for anything, but I'm here, it's now, and I'm gonna record this. And it came in handy for the movie years later. And I gave all those photographs and measurements to the prop guys. And I don't know if it was made up in Hollywood or down in Mexico, but people made these fiberglass bollards, and they're perfect. I mean, they're just exactly like the ones that are there in Southampton. There were some challenges in building the big exterior set, stage one. Those revolved around the fact that the tank that it was supposed to fit in could only be so large. And of course, Fox was trying to save money on the budget. So the idea was hatched to make the ship shorter than it really was. Instead of 883 feet in length, tip to tip, we're going to shorten it by about 10% so that it fits better. We save some money. Well, that entailed, you can't just shrink the whole ship, because they wanted the deck heights to be the right height and they wanted the width to be the right width. And so now we're starting to really screw around with proportions. So in order to make the funnels the right proportion, you can't just, they had to reduce them by 10% so that they would then be spaced properly along the entire length of the hull. And what they did was they decided to take out little sort of like slices of bread throughout the hull. We're going to take out 10 feet here and push it together, 10 feet here, push it together, and so forth. And that's how they truncated and made this ship a little bit smaller than it really was. This meant that the lifeboat davits, if they were left at the right spacing, would be too far apart and wouldn't work at all on their new, shortened boat deck. So the lifeboats were made about 10% smaller than they really are. Maybe it was 15%. It's a little bit vague in my memory now at this point. But those lifeboats that you see in the movie are really, not as big as they're not a full 30 feet that they really were on the real ship. Now, conversely, the grand staircase set was made a little larger. If you look at the Honor and Glory crowning time, right at that forward wall with the stairs coming down and the half landing, and then the fan-shaped landing below it, you'll notice that it's just a little wider. The clock panel is accurate, it's the proper scale, but one extra pilaster was added on either side of the Honor and Glory clock panel. Why was that done? If Jim Cameron was so after accuracy, why was that screwed around with? Well, the reason is people are bigger today than they were in 1912. And he did test people trying to pass each other on the stairs wearing their life jackets, and he said, it's just too tight. The average man, the average American man today is like 4 inches taller than they were in 1912. I'm just making that up, but it's a dramatic difference. And so they hashed it out and decided what we're going to do is we're just going to make the staircase a little bit wider so that, the actors will then appear to be in the correct scale. Aside from the exterior set having so much detail and being finished out to the last rivet, which was impressive enough, I was so thrilled that they actually made an effort to reproduce the ship's sheer. Now, the sheer is the sag that you see in the middle of a ship in those days. The bow is high, the stern is not quite as high, and the middle of the ship is bowed or sagging down lower. This was a design feature that was common among all vessels up until the 1950s and even the 60s. And it's difficult to do, it's complicated, it's expensive, and I was prepared from the get-go that Jim Cameron might say, look, we just can't go, we can't bother with this, we're going to have to make the hull basically flat, maybe we'll turn up the bow and the stern a little bit, but this is going to really muck up the works and slow the process down trying to figure this shear out. But to his credit, he wanted the sheer there. He says, it's got to look like a 1912 ocean liner. It's got to look like Titanic. So that sheer is there, and I never grew tired of seeing that and appreciating it, in addition to all the wonderful rivets all along the hull. That sent a tingle up my leg every time I saw it. There's no ship like that floating today. And that was reproduced just so beautifully. When they geared up for the cameras to roll, when the actors and the extras were lining the decks for shooting, they started a steam generating machine in the funnels that would send some steam out of the waste pipes on the funnels. And they would start smoke pots of some sort. And you'd start to see smoke coming out of those funnels. And because of the prevailing winds down there near Rosarito, Mexico, that smoke, that's the reason the whole set was built where it was. And the angle it was built was because of the prevailing winds. The smoke would blow generally aft, and it did. And I'm telling you, when you get those extras up there and the cameras start rolling and that smoke is coming out of the funnels and it's getting ready, to leave the dock, it was well, there are just no words to describe it. I mean, you're pinching yourself. You're realizing that you're witnessing motion picture history, that arguably not since, Cecil B. DeMille shot the Ten Commandments, has there been such a vast, complicated set with all the pieces and all the gears turning, and of such a scale. It was just so exciting. In October of '96, when I had my first visit down to the Fox Baja studio, where the sets were really getting advanced in their construction. Some of the funnels were in place, the deck houses were being built, and Ed Marsh, the documentarian, was following me around with his video camera. That was his job, to get my first impressions of the visual historian, as they credited me, seeing the ship, seeing the set for the first time and walking around. What would my impressions be? What were my reactions? It's so incredible to be standing here, seeing the Titanic take shape again after all these years. After 30 years of studying the ship so intently and painting the ship so many times, 100 times, for various book projects and so forth, to see this thing in 3 dimensions and be standing here, I am absolutely speechless. Tears welled up in my eyes when I first walked in here. And I played along dutifully. We went up on top of the officer's deck house, and I looked up and talked about the funnels and talked up this and talked up that. Well, we're up on top of the officer's quarters. That's the officer's quarters. Right underneath here was the first class staircase, the forward staircase. And I can't tell you what I'm most thrilled about. I think one thing that's always, as an artist, that I've been so particular about through the years is the actual color of the funnels on the White Star ships. And in artwork that's been done and models that have been built of the Titanic through the years, the funnel color is a very difficult shade to achieve. Most people get it too yellow, it seems to me. And in my years of research, I've come up with what I consider to be the correct color for the White Star buff. I gave them a sample, and you never know if they're going to copy the sample or do it accurately, but they certainly have in this case, and I can't find anything wrong in this color. They have recreated these funnels in the right color. It's just astounding. And there became a moment after 10 minutes or so of this where I stopped and I asked Ed, I'm sorry, could you just give me a few minutes alone here? And, oh, he said, I understand perfectly. And he walked away, and I had a few minutes to commune, with standing on what was virtually a full-size Titanic, being erected, being being rebuilt in 1996. You know, just surreal. I mean, in my wildest dreams, I mean, someone like myself could have only dreamed through all the decades that I had studied Titanic and painted Titanic and tried to bring her back to life in my own way. I could only dream of ever walking on a recreation of the ship that was virtually full size like that. Even though the funnels were only, 90% of their full size, they were big. They still were big. And the deck heights were the correct height, as I said. And it was just so impressive and so moving to me that I had to ask Ed for a moment alone. It's hard even to talk about today. I guess I cry easily. The older I get, the easier it is to cry. But I mean, that's one of the memories that, will always stick with me. The sets, the detail, the fabrics, the carpets were impressive enough, jaw-dropping to me, evocative beyond words. But when Deborah Scott, the costume designer, wardrobe person extraordinaire, when she designed the fashions and dressed the actors and the extras in their proper 1912 attire, and they were all milling around the reception room or walking into the dining saloon when this was being filmed, that was the icing on the cake. That's when you got the extra zinger of, I'm not just walking on this recreation, I'm there. It was so realistic, and you got so into it. And something that's really fascinating about it too, it's an interesting comment on the class system. The different fashions between first class, second class, and third class, the different wardrobe, the different hats that they wore, the different shoes they had on. I would never have expected before that experience working on the movie that we would sort of develop our own class system based on the wardrobe. It's hard to put into words. I mean, see if I can describe this, but you got so used to these fashions, they became normal. They were not, oh, look at those weird, cute 1912 fashions that are so out of date. And you very quickly got used to them being normal. This is a woman, and she's dressed lovely. She's beautiful. This is a third-class woman, and this is how she looks. And you just accepted it. Days and days and days of watching this, it became normal. And there was a sort of an unmentioned, indescribable sort of way that you viewed the actors based on their clothing. You knew this was a first-class person coming. Maybe she's just an extra. She doesn't deserve any more respect than anybody else. And yet you would stand aside and say, oh, excuse me, and where are you going to be today? Well, Jim has me on the grand staircase. I'm just supposed to be standing by the rail. Oh, be a lot of talking. Then a third-class person comes along, smoking a cigarette or something, and you just kind of think, well, and it's embarrassing to say, but your mind so quickly kind of goes back to that 1912 class system, to that mentality of deferring to the first class and the third class taking the back seat and the second class being somewhere in between, which second class doesn't really figure too much in Jim Cameron's movie. But I noticed that. I thought that was interesting, and you can't help it. You can fight it, but you come to accept the very different rigid class system between this first class world and the corsets, and the way they sat, and the way they had to get up from sitting and sit down, and the way they, all of this was choreographed beautifully, versus the casual, relaxed, colloquial third class, which was just a whole different world. It was just an interesting experience. 20 years later, I look at my experience on the big movie, which is how I think of it, and I realize what an event it was, what an important, pivotal period it was in my life. There was before the movie and there's after the movie, and so much has come after the movie. So much has evolved from my friendship with Jim Cameron, the expeditions to the wreck, working on Ghosts of the Abyss, Last Mysteries of the Titanic, the book Exploring the Deep, the Titanic expeditions, which I'm so proud of. Just so many projects, and they continue to this day. And my friendship with Jim, my association with his team, it's made me grow as a person. I learned so much from working on the project. It was full of surprises and delights. Like, for example, we were all surprised when the dining saloon set was flooded. And all the bowls and plates, instead of just being flooded and sinking to the floor of the dining room, started floating on the water and tinkling with each other. Here are these oak chairs falling over, and the room is flooding, and all this crockery, all this chinaware was just floating and tinkling again. It was a magical sort of thing in the midst of all of this, lights shorting out and sparking and all this dramatic stuff going on. Here was this delicate china, just tink, 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 So, little surprises like that just stick in your memory, and always will. I'm eternally grateful to Jim for the opportunities that he's opened up to me. I hope I've helped his projects and contributed in my own way to make the projects better. And what else can I say? I'm often asked what were my emotions or what was my experience when I first saw Titanic, or while I was exploring the wreck or doing my job. And basically that's my answer. I was busy. I had a job to do. On every single one of my dives, I was there for a specific reason. And there wasn't a whole lot of time to look out and just muse. In 2000, on the one dive that I was lucky to get on that trip, my job was to try to see and identify artifacts in the debris field from the sub that could be recovered. That was my task. I was familiar with what a lot of the little things looked like that came from the ship, and so that was my job. I was pinned to that little 4 or 5 inch viewport, the whole time. And the debris field, I have to say, is every bit as interesting as exploring the wreck itself. So much of the debris field really looks like a nuclear blast site. You just swear you're walking through Hiroshima. It's covered by rusticles, and it's dirty, and it's messed up, and destruction, just massive destruction, huge girders and beams and things, and then where you least expect it, there will be a teacup just sitting there upright with hardly any sediment settled in it at all, no mud on it. It's as if it was just put there. Identifiable things, parts of the wrought iron and gilt bronze balustrade from the first-class grand staircase. Sections of this on the seafloor with the 24-karat gilding still bright on that bronze, reflecting the sub's light, and just looking as pretty as the day it went down. It's just so interesting to think that nearly a century has passed, or when I last dived, it was 2005, and to think that after all those decades, these things, so much of it still looked just brand new. I respect those who say that the Titanic wreck site is a graveyard. I understand where they're coming from. Nearly 1,500 people lost their lives, not from drowning, but from freezing, most of them freezing to death on the surface. But there's no question that bodies did come to rest around the Titanic site, and that some may still be inside the wreck, although we've seen no sign whatsoever of any bones or any human remains directly. There are just too many matching pairs of shoes that I specifically noticed in 1986 when I was at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution working with Bob Ballard, and we were putting together his book, The Discovery of the Titanic. And this is before I did my paintings for his book. And I spent several days at Woods Hole going through thousands of photographs taken from above by the Angus vehicle and reviewing, video shot from the Alvin submersible. And you'll go across 50 feet or 50 yards of featureless bottom, just mud, nothing. Maybe the occasional deep sea shrimp or a rat tail fish. All of a sudden, boom, boom, there's two matching shoes about 2 feet apart. They're always turned the same, turned to the side in the same way, it seems like. And Bob had always said, no, we haven't seen any human remains. He'd many news conferences at that point, and he'd go, no, we haven't seen any human remains. And after I saw my third pair of shoes like that, after going through hundreds and hundreds of these images looking straight down on the bottom, a strobe camera from the Angus vehicle, here was another one, boom, boom, here's another one, boom, boom, different one. After the third one, I went upstairs from the basement there in the deep submergence laboratory, and I stood in the door, I'll always remember this, stood in the door of his office and looked at him, and he kind of put down his pen or something and said, "What?" I said, "It's hard for me to say without kind of tearing up, but I said, I think I've found your bodies." And he came downstairs and we went through the pictures again. I pointed him out and he just said, "Oh yeah, what else can that be?" Now, some critics have come back afterwards and said, "Oh no, people tie shoes together by their laces. They're just matching shoes that fell out of staterooms." But there's no way. There's no way. And I think it's generally accepted now, I hope. However, even though we know that bodies did come to rest, and I realize that in that sense it is a graveyard, she's also Titanic. She's indisputably the most famous, most notorious, if you want to say it that way, liner ever built, for sure, and perhaps vessel ever built, except for Noah's Ark. She's a legend. She's history. She's extremely important in history because of the impact that she had on maritime safety and the lessons that we learned from it. And yes, although you can find artifacts from her sister ships and other White Star ships of the era, and you can put a plate from any White Star ship on display and say, there, that's what Titanic's China service looked like. It's not the same as having the real thing there that a child can see or can touch, can reach out and actually touch Titanic. Looking at pictures in a book, watching a documentary, even in glorious HD 3D, is nothing like, I'm speaking from personal experience, nothing like standing inches from part of the ship or touching it. I don't know how else to say it. There's the value in perpetuating Titanic's history and in keeping her alive. Having it there for people to come close to and to commune with, and not just looking at pictures in a book or a documentary or something like that. In exploring Titanic, Titanic's interior during James Cameron's 2001 expedition, here's one of my absolute favorite surprises. Now, along the sides of Titanic on D deck, you can see from exterior photographs these two large doors forward in the first class area, just forward of the reception room. You see all the double windows of the dining saloon, the double ports of the reception room, and you get to these two doors that are there just forward of those portholes on D deck. And they show particularly well in a photograph taken by Kate Odell as she was disembarking Titanic at Queenstown. And these doors had little rectangular windows in them. Each door had one window, and it could be cranked down on the inside. It had a long worm gear underneath, and it could be cranked down and lowered. And if you look really closely at the Kate Odell photograph, you can see that there's a man sticking his head out and looking down at the tender, looking down at Kate Odell, taking the picture. Well, deck plans show in Olympic that these doors had some kind of inner door to them. You can see the exterior shell door. They're referred to as shell doors, these big, heavy steel doors that had the windows in them. Each door had a double window. And inside, according to deck plans, were these inner doors of some sort. No idea what those looked like, what form they took, or anything. And frankly, through the years, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to them because, well, I just didn't have a clue. I just didn't know what those might be. And it wasn't high on our list of priorities to try to look and try to find what these doors might be on the inside. So Jim Cameron is exploring with his little bot, his little ROV. He'd been looking at the bronze grilled doors, which were intact and still standing on the inside of that entrance vestibule on D-deck. He went around the corner and he wanted to see what was inside the vestibule itself. And he's looking at the paneling, the remains of oak paneling on the wall. And I'm outside in Mir 2, and as he comes around into the entrance vestibule, he says, okay, I'm in the vestibule now, give me light. So we maneuver the sub and we start shining our sunlight, if you will, in through these twin double rectangular windows. And he starts looking at that wall where those doors are, and he started imaging the most amazing pattern that we never expected. Long story short, it's an incredible wrought iron grilled gate is what those doors are that we see in the plans, that we had no idea what it would look like. Like the elevator grills, only a different design, entirely a different design. Both of these on the starboard side are sealed shut and closed. You can see their handles perfectly right there. And he got them from many different angles. He videotaped them and got footage of them, and I worked on them and enhanced them and clarified them and made a mosaic of, in at least one instance, to appear in the book Ghosts of the Abyss. And that's just one of my favorite discoveries that we found inside the ship, because it was just so completely unexpected. It was just a revelation to see an example of artwork, of human consciousness, of design that went into creating these grills. And here it is, sitting at the bottom of the North Atlantic where nobody even knew it existed. No photographs had ever been taken inside Olympic, to our knowledge, showing the inside of her shell doors there on D-deck. Why, I don't know. There may be a photograph out there somewhere, but we had not seen it. I'm not aware of it to this day. So the only knowledge we have, the only reference we have for that fancy grilled gate is what Jim Cameron documented in 2001. One of the biggest surprises that we found inside Titanic during James Cameron's 2001 expedition actually occurred on A deck first. He was exploring around behind the grand staircase area, and he came to the elevator lobby there on A deck, and he took a turn and he looked to see what the elevators looked like. Now, before this moment, all historians had to go on were the photographs of Olympic's elevator grills. There are several photographs. There's even newsreel footage of people getting in and out of one of Olympic's elevators. You can see the pattern. You can see the design of the grill. Jim pointed his little ROV toward these elevator grills, and to our great surprise, there were subtle differences. In fact, at the top, they were very different in design. This just completely blew our mind because we just assumed, as everybody naturally assumes, Titanic is just another Olympic. Why would they change the design of the elevator grills? But there they were. And in my work to enhance some of this video imagery for the book Ghosts of the Abyss in 2002, 2003, I was able to bring out a lot more detail. And it turns out that some of the grill work at the bottom of the gates are also a little bit different. And we explored the different decks. I think Jim got good imagery of A deck, C deck, and D deck. And all of the grills appear to match each other, but they are all distinctly different from what we find in Olympic. Nicolas Marschall in France was able to take all the photographs that I provided him and so forth, and he looked at all the enhanced imagery and compared it with the photographs that we have of Olympic and the newsreel footage of Olympic's elevator grill. And he created a very nice graphic comparing Olympic with Titanic. So we can really see the difference between the two of them. Another interesting difference between the two ships, it's very, very minor, nobody would care about this, but I noticed it right away, was that the push button, the call button, right below the annunciator panel that told you what deck the elevator was on, well, several inches below that is a gold-plated with a little ivorine button in the middle. Ivorine is a sort of an early plastic item that was made. Back then in 1912, you didn't have plastics too much. You had cellulose, you had Bakelite. Ivorine was one of the few plastics that were being developed. And it looked just like ivory close up. It was very good. All the little tags above the beds that said 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, the berth numbers, those were ivorine and so forth. So here are these little buttons. And in Titanic, to my surprise, it's spaced differently from the annunciator panel. It's a little bit farther apart. They either lowered the button a little bit because they decided, it's just a little bit too high, the kids can't reach it or whatever, or they raised the panel, the annunciator panel maybe a little bit. I believe the panel is in the correct place as Olympic, but the button is slightly lower. So was this a conscious designer's decision to improve the practicality of the location of this button? Or was it just sort of a haphazard, maybe the person who installed that button on that deck accidentally drilled the hole too low in Titanic? I don't know. Each deck serviced by the elevators in first class had its own lobby connected to it. And on D deck in particular, it was especially expansive. In fact, in Titanic, they expanded the size of the elevator lobby there on D deck compared with Olympic. In Olympic, they had a wall just opposite the elevator doors. And then behind that, there was a walkway where you could walk through that sort of shielded or protected the staterooms that were forward of that. In Titanic, there was a general consensus that we want to make the reception room larger on D deck. The reception room went all around the grand staircase and extended and connected to that elevator lobby there, just outside the elevators. And so in order to enlarge that room, they did two things. They notched into the first class entrance vestibule on the port and starboard side. Instead of the vestibule being so large and a big rectangular area, they took a corner of it and opened that up so there was a little bit more room in the reception room. Not much, but just a little bit more shoulder room for people. And the other thing that they did was to get rid of this wall that was just standing there really for no reason between the elevator lobby and the staterooms. They got rid of that wall, so now the elevator lobby extended all the way to the walls of the stateroom area forward of that. So it greatly increased the size of that lobby. But aside from knowing that from deck plans, we knew that that change was made. We, of course, assumed the decor of the lobby on D deck was the same as that in Olympic. And there are existing photographs of Olympic's D deck reception lobby. You can see the light fixtures overhead. They're cut glass, just as on the upper decks, on B deck and C deck above. And the ceiling design is a certain design, rectangular shapes, not matching the rest of the reception room, which is just adjacent. They had their own sort of ceiling design there in Olympic's reception room. That's what we expected to find in Titanic. Now in 2001, on 9/11, as a matter of fact, the very day we were rescuing the little bot Elwood, after 2 previous attempts, finally on 9/11, we were successful. I shouldn't say we were a team, but it was Jim, obviously, was able to rescue Elwood from that starboard side entrance vestibule, hook onto it, and pull it through this lobby, through the D-deck reception room. And he hadn't, on his previous dives, he hadn't really looked at the ceiling or anything else. He had looked at a few things. But it was on this rescue of Elwood, slowly pulling Elwood out. And at one point he got hung up on something and he was stuck basically in the middle of the elevator lobby there. And there was some sediment going around and so forth, and he was trying to get unhooked. But meanwhile, he's looking up and down with his camera, trying to get his bearings. And what happened? During one of these brief little things with the camera lens, he gets a glimpse of the ceiling overhead, and it's the same pattern as in the reception room. It's not like Olympic. In Titanic, they extended that same design with the little buttons and all that, all the way around through the reception room, distinctly different from Olympic. The other thing that he found was that the light fixtures there in the lobby, they were octagonal, which again matched the main reception room, not like Olympic, which had the cut glass circular light fixtures. So there's the second big surprise. The ceiling is totally different here in this location than in Olympic. The light fixtures are totally different. So, you know, not an illogical design change, but a surprise. We would have never known if that room had not been explored. We would have never known. We would have always assumed that the room was just the same there as in Olympic. And that leads into an interesting aspect of this whole thing. Because Titanic, where she was not photographed, is always assumed to be like Olympic, when we can show that there is a difference, that's obviously important. That fills in a gap in history. Oh, look, this is different from the way it was in Olympic. But where it is also the same, also confirms that it was the same as Olympic. We can't always assume that it's just the same. You need to document every single place and every single room in order to lay it down, to close that book, to say, okay, the reception room windows, the ceiling design, the columns in Titanic's reception room are like Olympic's. But look at that. Titanic had planter boxes built into the corner nooks and Olympic didn't. You know, and you can go down the list. Those are the surprises. So we're not as surprised when we learn that the ships were identical in a certain area or not, but it's still just as valuable information. There's no question about it. There are still people that, oh, that's not important. It's just like Olympic. We don't need to, that doesn't matter. Just wasting time, wasting money, you know, trying to, but it's totally important to document the ship in every aspect, because we don't know. The records do not exist. That room was never photographed in Titanic. No reception room photograph, for example. I mean, we're just talking about the reception room. No photograph exists of Titanic's reception room. So it's all important to document it and be able to find the things that were a little bit different, the things that were a lot different, and the things that were just the same as Olympic. It's all valuable information. And one more thing that was found in that elevator lobby on D deck is extra columns that were not in Olympic. Because they took out that wall that was sitting there for no reason between the elevator lobby and the stateroom area farther forward. They removed that wall. That now made such a large area, they felt the need, evidently, to install a column on either side. So there are now 2 more new columns on D-deck in that location. There are other new columns in Titanic that Olympic did not have. That's another episode. But those 2 new columns there in the elevator lobby were finally recorded on videotape and documented. During James Cameron's 2001 and 2005 explorations of the wreck of Titanic, he got deep inside the ship on both occasions. And of course, we were always hoping to find new things. We were hoping to learn as much as we could about the ship's structure, her design, and so forth. We expected to see a lot of decay, a lot of ruination, a lot of debris, and so forth. But we hoped that we would see decor, surviving decor, things like that might teach us something new about Titanic. And we were not disappointed. Now, Olympic was thoroughly photographed when she debuted in 1911. The Harland and Wolff official photographer, Robert Welch, went throughout the ship and took a number of photographs of staterooms, public rooms, staircases, and so forth. And when the ship got to Southampton in the ensuing years and throughout her entire 24-year lifetime, there are just hundreds and thousands of photographs of Olympic. So we've had those to go by, as opposed to Titanic, which was basically considered a duplicate of Olympic. And that perception of her is evident in the fact that so few photographs of her interior were taken or are known to have been taken. A few were taken in Belfast, and some more were taken in Southampton during the week that she was there. But most by far of Titanic's interior was not documented photographically to our knowledge. Neither of the grand staircases. Apparently they looked so similar to Olympic, nobody bothered to take a single picture. There's only one known photograph in Titanic's dining saloon, for example, first-class dining saloon. That was taken by Frank Brown at lunchtime on the way to Queenstown. Her other public rooms, not a single photograph of Titanic's lounge, and so on and so forth. One known photograph does exist, taken inside Titanic's Turkish bath cooling room while she was at Southampton, a low-quality half-tone image that appeared in several magazine illustrations. So what we have had to go by for most of Titanic, in terms of her interiors, are the photographs that exist for Olympic, with nothing else at our disposal, nothing else to consult, and no historical record, no written record that we're aware of. Most of the interior of the ship, much of it at least, was presumed to be exactly like Olympic. So, nevertheless, of course, you're hoping for surprises when you're exploring inside the ship. And as I said, we were not disappointed. One of the big surprises was in the Marconi room area. Now, again, all we had to go by were several photographs taken inside Olympic's Marconi room. Now, Olympic's Marconi room in the early part of her career was located in a different place from Titanic's. It was on the outboard port side of the officers' quarters. They actually had a window above the operator's table, the operator's desk, and so forth. But we could see on the right-hand wall in one of the photographs of Olympic, 1911, we could see on the wall the double panel switchboard, AC/DC switchboard mounted on the wall there, easily accessible from the operator's table, and below that the 2 field regulators. Now, this is what we expected inside Titanic. The only known photograph taken in Titanic's Marconi room was taken by Frank Brown en route to Queenstown. And he stood back at the forward end of the room and got a picture of, I believe it's Harold Bride leaning over the operator's table and working. Unfortunately, this is a double exposure, and I actually spent a lot of time working with this double exposure. I got the best image I could from the people who handle the original Brown photographs, Davison and Associates in Ireland. I got the best image I could from them, and I spent a lot of time working on that image to erase and get rid of that double exposure, to restore the photograph to the way the scene really looked. And so I'm pretty proud of that. But this is our only known image of Titanic's Marconi room. And although the right-hand edge is cropped out, it doesn't show up in the Brown photograph, we always assumed that on that wall, just like on Olympic, you would find the double panel AC/DC switchboard and regulators mounted over there. So in 2001, when Jim Cameron was exploring the wreck, that was high on our list of priorities, was to see, of course, what was left of the historic Marconi room. And to our great disappointment, that whole area where the operator's room was located, which was amidships, not off to the port side the way it was in Olympic, it's right in the middle of the ship under a skylight, that entire area of the officers' quarters is just blasted through from hydrodynamic force during the sinking. That has to be what happened to it. The walls are all gone. There's no sign of anything left in that area. It's just blown through. So we were disappointed not to find anything left in the operator's cabin. But there was a fragment of the wall standing on the port side of that. This is the wall that we thought would have held the switchboard and the regulators. And there was nothing sticking to that wall. It just looked empty. Obviously, this equipment had been torn off and blown away as well. Well, later on that expedition, Jim Cameron got video imagery looking toward the Marconi room from the port side, where we could see the other side of that wall. And it's quite distant, but in the distance you could see a grainy, noisy video. You could see the wall standing there and something on the wall, but we really couldn't tell what it was. And after the expedition, it was my job to enhance the video imagery that he got during that trip for the book Ghosts of the Abyss, to create mosaics, to create enhanced, clarified stills. What I did was I applied numerous consecutive frames of video over each other, carefully aligning each one so that they, kept the objects exactly in the same place. And that averaged out the noise, the snow, if you will, the static in the scene. And in doing that, for this image looking to starboard from the port side, from outside the officers' quarters, looking at this distant wall that was standing there, as I enhanced it, I could start to see these 4 circular dials at the top, these circular things. What are those? And then these rectangular things below that. And one thing led to another, and Parks, I was talking to Parks through this whole thing, Parks Stevenson, and lo and behold, it's the AC/DC switchboard mounted on the wrong side of this wall where we never expected it. Unlike Olympic, instead of being mounted in the operator's cabin where they could easily access it, it was around the corner in the silent room, or the silent cabin, which was a specially insulated, soundproofed room that held the very noisy spark discharger, and they had to dampen that room, I believe, with asbestos, because there were first-class staterooms nearby, just across the corridor. That room, because it was insulated, withstood that concussive force, that hydrodynamic force as the ship was sinking. The wireless operator's cabin and the sleeping cabin where the wireless people stayed, blown away, but that silent room remained intact, and only slowly did those walls dissolve over decades and decades. And that's why all that equipment is still there in that room. So there, preserved on the wrong side of that wall, is the AC/DC switchboard and field regulators. But what I am excited about is that the field regulators still show where the lever was left by most likely Harold Bride on the night of the sinking in the last few minutes as they were trying to control the power of the spark and keeping it in tune and trying to get those last distress messages out. I mean, that is frozen in time. And even the knife switches, the electrical switches for making the connection for the power on or the power off had obviously been, manipulated. Both of these items, the AC/DC double panel switchboard and these two regulators, found in a totally surprise location on the opposite side of a wall where we expected to be unprecedented. And later, in fact, in Olympic, when they moved Olympic's wireless room from the port side to the midship location where Titanic had her wireless room, the switchboard is back again in the operator's room, not in the silent room. So this seems to have been an experiment that was done with Titanic and no other ship. They tried it, and for some reason they went back with Olympic and presumably with Britannic. We don't know yet because Britannic's wireless area hasn't been explored in that detailed a way yet. Another great discovery right below the switchboard and the field regulators is the rotary spark discharger. Synchronous rotary spark discharger, I guess, is the official name for it. And there it is. It's a teak sound-insulated box lined on the inside with lead. The lid is open, and inside you can see this disc, which was the highest, latest, greatest technology at the time, cutting edge, electrical, wireless technology. Here's this 10-inch disc that rotated at, 2,000 RPM or something like that, don't quote me. 16 studs sticking out of it, metal studs, but it's all right there. Got a really good view of that in 2005. There's a Galathea crab right next to it. But this was Titanic's voice. This was the object that sent out the distress call. If it wasn't for that thing, if that thing had not been working that night, all bets are off. Ship would have gone down. You'd have lifeboats out there floating for God knows how long. This was the most amazing thing to discover. It wasn't a surprise that it was there, but it was a wonderful thing to find it, and it was a surprise to find it open, completely open, and all of this mechanics visible right there to view. It's one of many surprises which we found in Titanic, and we can talk about in another episode. A few surprises awaited us inside Titanic's Turkish bath cooling room. Now, Jem had tried to get in there in 2001, the Ghosts of the Abyss expedition, and it had looked too dicey. And he got really close, but when it got to the F-deck stairway going down, it kind of started to silt out, and he bailed on it. And then we had some bad weather or something, and we never got back to it. So it was high on our list of priorities for the 2005 expedition. And in fact, as I recall, he got in there right off the bat. It was one of the first things he wanted to knock off his list. So it was that important. This time he was able to get in. He found his way in. It was not silted out. Wasn't a problem at all. And amazingly, all the way deep down inside the wreck on F deck, got through the little vestibule there and into the cooling room. And that was one of the biggest surprises of the expedition. It turned out that room was so beautifully preserved. I always predicted it would be nicely preserved because everything inside it was basically indestructible. Ceramic, fired, tiles, teak throughout the room. Teak is not affected by the seawater. Every bit of teak we'd seen every place else on the wreck was in great condition. And we knew that room was completely outfitted in teak, so we expected the teak to be in good shape. Obviously the bronze light fixtures, ceiling light fixtures, and a table lamps were made out of bronze. We expected to see all of that at least recognizable. If a little bit damaged and so forth, at least it should be well preserved. Now, with Olympic, many photographs exist of her Turkish bath cooling room. It was laid out entirely differently from Titanic. It was built against the side of the hull, a different layout. With Titanic, they made the room a little bit smaller. They put it in a different angle, a different location. But the general theme of decor was exactly the same. It was just a little bit smaller room. But from these existing photographs of Olympic, we knew that next to all the little lounges, the little beds, that there were tables, Moroccan, Arabian, octagonal-shaped tables, all beautifully inlaid. All the furniture was beautifully inlaid. And here were these bronze table lamps next to the beds. Get inside Titanic's Turkish bath. We're looking around. The sediment level is so low in certain places because it's so deep inside the ship and there's just no current at all. So although the rusticles were quite long where they existed, and there were even growths coming up out of the sediment, little finger growths that we'd never seen before anywhere, amazing things. But the sediment level was so low that at times we were imagining we were actually seeing the linoleum on the floor, which we weren't, but it was very tempting to imagine that, look at this, we can actually see the floor for the first time inside Titanic. Anyway, as Jim was exploring around after a while, and as we're analyzing the video later, we realized, you know what's missing here? There are no bronze lamps. Obviously the furniture has been all blown around during the sinking and everything was a whirlpool in there. But these lamps were this big. You know, they were big, half semicircular, hemispherical tops and so forth. And with the sediment level so low, we would have seen one of those somewhere sticking up. And there are no lamps in this room. Well, we look at the single surviving archival photograph that was taken of Titanic's Turkish bath in Southampton. Very grainy photograph. It's a halftone photo. All we have is the halftone version from a couple of magazines. Where the actual print is or the negative is, we don't know. But from this single image, which I have in my collection because I've got two different magazines where it's published, 1912 magazine. So I actually took those two. They're cropped a little bit differently. I mosaicked them together to make a slightly wider image than either one of them individually is. And there are no table lamps in this 1912 photograph taken at the dock in Southampton. Now, I had always known this, but we had always assumed that the lamps just haven't arrived yet. The ship is sitting there in Southampton for a week. All kinds of stuff is still being shipped on board. And the lamps, look at that, the table, they took a picture before the lamps were installed. Well, here we were, now inside the wreck, no sign of table lamps. So this is a fascinating, interesting surprise to learn that there was a conscious decision, apparently, not to put the table lamps in that room. Evidently, the overhead lighting was considered enough. I don't know. Now, it's possible that the shipment of lamps didn't make it to the ship in time, and maybe they were going to be installed on the next voyage. We don't know. Another interesting thing that's just utterly fascinating about the Turkish bath is the stools, the three stools. There were three dressing cubicles at the far aft end of the cooling room. And each cubicle had its own little stool. And you can see it in Olympic photographs, and you can even see them in that single Titanic photograph. You can see the very stools. Now, these dressing cubicles had heavy drapes hanging down to provide the privacy, and the stools were inside of those drapes. Where did we find these stools? They're all upside down, perfectly in a row, right at the entrance of each cubicle. Boom, boom, and boom. Just sitting there like this, in between the teak wood dividers of these stalls. The concussive force of the sinking, that room flooding, the collision with the seafloor, crashing down at something like 25, 30 knots, crashing into the seabed. How did those stools end up in a perfect row, basically right where they were supposed to be all along? So my theory is that since the dressing cubicles are at the aft end of the room, and the room is tilted at an angle. The water is flowing aft, filling the room aft. It's pushing these drapes inward, and the cubicles are the last things to flood. They fill with water. The stools obviously float. They go up to the ceiling, the overhead, and they're trapped up there at the aft end of the room, right above their dressing cubicles. Now, how they stayed exactly above each dressing cubicle, I can't imagine, because there's free air above the cubicles. Those cubicles, the walls between the cubicles don't go all the way to the ceiling. So I don't know. Somehow these 3 stools ended up stuck to the overhead. As the ship sank, went down, we've got thousands and thousands of feet. The pressure is increasing, the pressure is increasing. Eventually, all the air is just sucked out, pressured out of these wooden stools. The stools become negative and they sink and they float back down. And because the top of the stool has the seat, it's heavier than the bottom of the stool. So that's the thing that leads to the bottom. Instead of being the thing that floated originally because it's wood, now the top of the stool is the heaviest part of the stool, so it's coming down. They all come down right to the bottom of their cubicles. Ship is plunging to the bottom, crashes into the bottom, plows into the mud. The stern part of the bow section settles down, crashes down. But that forward momentum of crashing into the bottom, that braking force, sent those 3 overturned stools on the linoleum sliding forward. The drapes probably went as far forward as they could. The 3 stools went sliding, and they ended up exactly where they are today. It's literally a stopped clock. You're seeing a moment in time. What must have happened? What those stools did, where they ended up, and because of the angle of the ship and the way it plowed into the bottom, the whole thing. I was just fascinated by that. And there they are today, sitting there in very, very little sediment, each of them with their four legs sticking up like 3 soldiers in a row, right where they were left, April 15th, 1912, at a depth of 12,500 feet. One last surprise awaited us in the Turkish bath cooling room. Actually, 2. There's a thing called a weighing chair or a weighing scale. It was a chair that you could sit in, and it would weigh you, and it would print out a little thing, and you could fill in the ticket, and it would say how many stones you weighed or whatever. It was called a weighing chair. A jockey chair is another term for it. And apparently they were somewhat common in 1912. And in the deck plans for Olympic and Titanic, you can see where this chair is located. It's on the port wall next to the entrance. In Titanic, that's where it's indicated on the plan, on the port side, just as you come through the vestibule. There was no weighing chair there when we explored the room. And where was it found? It was found at the forward end of the room, up against that wall, just next to the marble fountain, in a whole different place. Not a big deal, but definitely the jockey chair. You could see the scale. There are remains of it. You can see the 4 legs right there, plain as can be, found in an unexpected place. And the last thing is something called a valuables locker. This is also made out of teak. And in Olympic, we knew where it was mounted in a specific place. But again, Titanic's layout for that room was totally adjusted and changed. So we didn't know where the valuables locker was fitted in Titanic. And this locker had all these little drawers. It was maybe this wide and this high, and maybe 15 drawers or something like that. And each one had its own key. And you could put your valuables in there, of course, as you went to do the Turkish bath thing, or you went to go swimming or whatever. So in exploring this room, this valuables locker was found on the opposite side of the entrance vestibule, where we had no idea if we would find it there. It had obviously recently fallen because it wasn't knocked there during the sinking or during the collision with the bottom. It was on top of other debris. It was on top of the jockey chair, the weighing chair. I shouldn't say was, it still is. And it's lying there, and you can see the various drawers. It was fitted up on the starboard wall of the entrance vestibule until fairly recently, maybe just a decade or two before Jim Cameron got in there. And then it tore away from the wall. You can see the holes where it was attached in that on that steel entrance vestibule wall, and has fallen down on the jockey chair in a position we would have never known where it was located. And there it rests today. Some of the drawers slightly open. Another time capsule. It was a lot of fun, very exciting for me to come across these surprises, analyzing the footage, being able to mosaic the photographs together, the images, enhance them, clarify them. This was a super thrill to me, and there are a lot more surprises than these still to come, and we'll talk about those in another episode. When the first imagery was returned after the discovery of Titanic in 1985, and then the better pictures that came to us in 1986, we got a good idea of how the bow section looked. And we could tell right away that the anchor crane, that thing right here at the very front of the bow, was turned in an unusual position. Under the normal sailing conditions at sea, that crane is always aimed, if you will, directly aft. That's the position it's supposed to be in. It's grappled in that position. It's tied down in that position by some heavy cables to either side of these forward fairleads to keep the crane from, in a heavy sea, even moving a little bit. So it was surprising to see that the crane was turned around 180 degrees from the angle that we all thought it should be. And it's aiming directly forward of the ship, perfectly forward of the ship. Not slightly off by a couple of degrees, but perfectly. In those initial Bob Ballard video, you can see it passing over the bow, and it's just directly forward. Also, we could see from the initial imagery that came back from the wreck, we could see that the steel cover for the number 1 hatch was missing. It's now just this big squarish gaping hole in the forecastle or the forecastle. This steel cover is massively heavy. It's held down by about 40 huge steel bolts, fully battened down to go to sea. It should not have been off. So the question immediately arose, why is the hatch cover off? And why is the forward anchor crane turned 180 degrees from where it should be? This was a mystery. It didn't take too long to kind of put 2 and 2 together and realize that the bow has crashed into the seabed, buried itself, I don't know how far at the very bow there, deep into the mud, and then compressed and crumpled just forward of the bridge, blowing out sides underneath the well deck from hydraulic compression. And when you have this kind of hydraulic compression going on, once it hits the bottom, there's a huge amount of pressure to blow upward. The water has to go somewhere. The bow is completely flooded at this point. Here's a hatch cover that, yes, it's bolted down very securely, but it's just bolted down with a bunch of bolts. And what clearly happened is that when the bow crashed into the bottom and that hydraulic pressure of all that water inside had to go someplace, it blew out underneath the sides of the well deck and blew that number 1 hatch cover off. Sheared off, tore off all those bolts, and up went the hatch cover, flying into the water column, blown off. Now there's a second thing at work here, and that's called downblast. As the ship is sinking, it's entraining a current of water behind it, just like when you take your hand through the swimming pool and you go like this. You can have a little piece of paper follow along right behind you. And this is what was happening as the bow was sinking. All this water was following it at the same speed as Titanic was, which we estimate was maybe 25 knots, something like that, maybe 30 knots. Crashes into the bottom. And once the bow section stops, where's all this water going to go that's coming down? Well, it has to go out to the side. It has to go forward. has to spread out like an inverted mushroom. So the forward hatch cover blows off from that hydraulic compression, and here comes the downblast, immediately hitting it and now blowing it away from the bow section. Where did it blow? It blew directly forward of the wreck, about 165 feet forward of the very tip of the bow is where you can find that steel hatch cover today, upside down, way out in the mud, way forward of the wreck. Now, the side of the hatch cover has a big ding in the side of it. What could have caused that ding? Well, maybe it was just a couple of the bolts that held on a little too long, so that when it blew off, it just twisted in a certain direction, and that's why there's the ding in the side. Jim Cameron has the theory that we've got the anchor crane turned 180 degrees from where it should be, and we've got a big ding in the number 1 hatch cover. Put 2 and 2 together. And I've argued a little bit with Jim about this because, and again, I'm no engineer, but in my opinion, the anchor crane, the center post of it is very, very strong. It's hefty. But the rest of the anchor crane, the part that would have been hit to swing it around forward, is very, very thin. It's just thin rods and so forth. How could you take this multi-ton solid steel hatch cover and bang it into the forward anchor crane, which spun it around exactly 180 degrees? Well, he says, I think that's what happened, and he's got his reasons. Personally, I'm just a little suspicious of Jim's theory because of the fact that the anchor crane is so perfectly squared up with the bow. It's just directly forward of the bow. And if the hatch cover had struck it, this way, it could have spun it around in any direction, or it should have ended up in some other direction, not necessarily perfectly forward. And that's what makes me a little bit suspicious. It's interesting to note that there are archival photographs of Olympic that do show this anchor crane in this forward attitude. It is some sort of a stowed position for the crane. You only see it that way in Belfast or in the dry dock there at Belfast. But there are photographs that show the crane exactly as we see it on Titanic today, which kind of makes me think that maybe on the maiden voyage, maybe on April 14th, the crew were doing something. The weather was great. It was beautiful. There was no reason not to be out on the forecastle, fixing things, trying things. Maybe the crew, had turned it deliberately forward for a reason and left it that way overnight. And that's why we see it that way today, because we see absolutely this gets back to Jim's theory again, we see absolutely no damage to the anchor crane whatsoever, even in the spindly parts of it. It's perfectly intact. And so I just have my doubts that something as heavy as that gigantic, heavy steel hatch cover could have slammed into it without leaving the least trace of damage. This is what I call the anchor crane mystery. We have Jim's theory that the hatch cover banged into it and spun it around 180 degrees. And then there's my thought that, that couldn't have happened because there's absolutely no damage to the anchor crane. I mean, how do you wash those two theories? We don't have surviving crew member accounts of anybody doing work up there on the forecastle on April 14th. So it's something that may just have to remain a mystery. With Britannic, thinking about her brief life, it's kind of hard to decide whether Titanic had a more tragic, unfortunate, disgusting end, or whether Britannic did. Titanic at least got to carry some paying passengers, but she never got to complete a single commercial voyage. With Britannic, she was ripped away from the White Star Line before she ever carried a single, passenger. She was requisitioned by the British Admiralty to serve as a hospital ship in World War I, and didn't even survive a year. I think she made 5 or 6 voyages to the Mediterranean, to the Aegean Sea, and bringing back wounded. And she was the third and the most improved and the most advanced of the 3 sister ships by far. In some ways, she was a holdover from Titanic. She was Titanic. She had the advantages and the improvements of Titanic, but she also had additional improvements, decoration advancements that Titanic didn't have. Titanic was more like Olympic in many ways, and yet was a new generation of ship in its own way. And then Britannic comes along, and it's like one-ups Titanic. So we really had she was the largest ship in the world at the time. She's the largest ship sunk during World War I, and to this date is the largest passenger vessel on any of the world's seabed, anywhere. She's it. And it is just so sickening that such an advanced ship that, they tried to take the knowledge from the Titanic disaster and incorporate it into Britannic to make her even safer. And they did. I mean, they dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. She was to have been such an amazing ship. And then to go down like that in a fraction of the time Titanic did, 55 minutes. Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, and Britannic was gone within 55 minutes after a mine, again like Titanic, hitting at just the wrong place. And I guess the watertight doors were open because it was maybe a shift change, and I don't know, but it just, everything went wrong. And fortunately, everybody was able to get off in lifeboats, except for 30 people who lost their lives in a lifeboat when it drifted aft into the still spinning port side propeller. Diving Britannic is a totally different experience from diving Titanic. Titanic is in complete blackness, 2.5 miles down. There is life down there. You'll see the anemones, you'll see the deep sea shrimp, you'll see little jellies, you'll see rat-tail fish, Galathea crabs. When you really add it up, there's a lot of life down there. Slugs that are crawling around both inside the wreck and outside the ship. That's a whole topic in itself. The creatures that like to live inside the wreck versus the ones that live outside. We even saw once what we called the bat wing, because we didn't know what else to call it. It was like a squid-like creature, maybe this long, with little wings that was doing this. It was like nothing we'd seen anywhere else around Titanic or in it, and it was just hovering up right against a reception room stained glass window, and it was like our little friend. And then there's the anemone on the tip of the bow, railing that was always there every expedition to greet us. And anemones are not plants, they're animals. They look like little plants, but of course everything at that depth is an animal. Plants need light. And so everything down there is some sort of an animal. But you get to Britannic and it's an entirely different environment. You're only at 400 feet to the bottom there. The bottom is a snow white like gypsum sand. The water in the Mediterranean is astonishingly clear, just the clearest I've seen anywhere. You can almost see the faint hazy outline of this dark shape of the wreck below you from the moment you stick your head in the water at 400 feet above the bottom. But it's this aqua blue light that of course gets dimmer and darker as you descend, but it's still plenty light in the middle of the day. And the sea life is everywhere. The fish by the thousands. They'll dart this way and that and flash in the light, all over the wreck. The hull is largely covered with sea growth, anemones and barnacles. I don't know what they're called. All different colors, bright yellow, bright magenta purples. And you don't see those colors until you get close to the wreck. When you're approaching from a distance in a submersible, it has a monochromatic look to it, and it's just this dark shape that appears out of the gloom with this bright sandy bottom. So it's this dark against the white, and you don't see these colors on the hull at all. And then as you get closer and closer and closer, pretty soon you start to see these colors, like I said, bright lemon yellows and, just magenta purples right next to each other. Purple and yellow right next to each other. Pretty dramatic. When Jacques Cousteau discovered the wreck of Britannic in 1975 and then went back in 76 and explored it in some detail, that was it. No one went back for 2 decades. And Bob Ballard in 95 wanted to go back out there, relocate the ship, and really do a comprehensive photo mosaic of the entire hull and explore it over the period of about a week. And the submersible that he was using was called the NR-1. It's a Navy research sub, and it's a big one. Unlike a little tiny Delta submersible, which was just a 2-man torpedo, basically, which is what I had experienced 2 years before when I dived Lusitania on a Bob Ballard expedition. Now suddenly we went to the other extreme, and it was a good-sized submarine, a real submarine, 13 crewmen on board, or it could accommodate 13 people, I think, inside. Maybe 11 plus a guest or two, and I was one of the guests when my dive came. But Bob Ballard was the first one to go down, and we had good weather. It was looking great. And he went down, he did the initial look at the ship and so forth, just a look. I don't think there was much photography. There wasn't any methodical side scanning or mosaicing yet. Came back up, and he said, okay, while the weather's holding out and we've got good weather, because we're not sure about the next couple of days, I want you to go next, Ken. Nighttime is a good time to do the side scan sonar. And they got the most amazing images of the wreck with this side scan. If you reverse the imagery, it's black ink on white paper. If you reverse that, take a picture and make it into a negative, it looks like you've lit the ship with a light. Instead of looking at this weird negative image, it looks like a positive image. So I was all over that. As soon as we got those side scans back on board the surface vessel, Bob Ballard and I were just all over those, photographing them. He thought those were the best thing they brought back from the whole expedition, I think. What resulted from that expedition with Ballard was a whole new encyclopedia of knowledge about the wreck. Her condition, situation, where the funnels ended up, how she sank, what happened. Once you analyze the imagery and you look at the side scans, you can figure out exactly what she went through, how the funnels fell off one by one, how the ship was doing a slow turn to the right, coming around to the sort of the southwest, and that last forward funnel was the last one to come off. Even though it was the first one to enter the water, it somehow stayed attached because the ship, I guess, wasn't heeling over so far. The others literally fell off or melted away, as some survivors referred to it. But that first funnel was discovered right near where it would have been if it plowed into the bottom, broke away, and from that forward momentum, just angled farther forward a little bit on the sand, and that's where it is today. So it's clear that that was the last one to come off. And you can just go down, you can just count this. This one I know is number 4. This was probably number 3 because it's closest to number 4. And you can go along and identify the funnels. Aside from the difference in the environment where Britannic lies, there's just such a totally different feel for the entire wreck. She is so intact, aside from the buckled bow where she crashed into the bottom during sinking and the funnels separated. Incredibly, almost every one of her ventilators is still attached. The lifeboat davits, these massive heavy cranes, are still attached, and the ship is lying over on its side about 78, 79 degrees. And it just amazes me in this shallow, corrosive, warm, you would think, Mediterranean water, that more damage hasn't occurred, more corrosion hasn't occurred, that she is so intact. You compare her with the Andrea Doria, which sank in 1956, much more recently. She's on her side as well. The Empress of Ireland sank in the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1914. She's on her side as well. Both of those ships gone. All that's left is the shell of their hulls. All the superstructures have long since fallen away, crumbled away. Why is Britannic so incredibly intact? It can't be the sea life, all the barnacles that are holding her together. So it's this mystery. I don't understand it. Either they made Britannic so much stronger than Titanic, which is all the more ironic and tragic, or there's something about the environment that she is so much better preserved. But she is like night and day compared with the Titanic wreck. Titanic, except for the intact part of the bow section, is a blast zone, a nuclear waste site. Britannic, just the opposite. She's the last of those Olympic-class ships to survive in such good condition. Olympic is long gone. She was dismantled in the 1930s, I think before her time, and some of her crew believed the same thing. She could have gone on for several more years, but she's gone. Titanic survives. She's still with us in a completely destroyed state. But here's Britannic, the forgotten sister, the third sister that we have, for decades, for 100 years, have tended to think of as being lost, the lost ship, the ship that never carried a paying passenger. And yet, she's there. She's down there. She's in the best condition of the two wrecked ships. She looks to me, she felt to me like a steed that had just stumbled, that wasn't supposed to be down there, wasn't supposed to be wrecked, was caught in some unlucky circumstance and is lying on her side in this shallow water, just waiting to get up and prance again, to just 400 feet to the surface, sail again. Except for the barnacles that are on her, it almost looks as if she could sail again. The recent documentary, Titanic, The New Evidence, is an intriguing, well put together, highly watchable show. I enjoyed it very much. It's tight, it's well edited, it, shall we say, spins a good yarn. There are a few aspects to some of the points that were raised in the documentary that people are taking issue with. I'm not an engineer. I'm not qualified to comment on the tensile strength of steel or the heat in the coal bunker, the temperature of the fire, or any of that stuff. Who said what fireman said what, where he was standing, what he saw. But I am all about photography, and I'm good at photo analysis. And in the documentary, there's a couple of these wonderful photographs taken by John Kempster of Titanic sailing down Victoria Channel for her sea trials on April 2nd, 1912. Wonderful new photographs that, although of course they've existed all these years in an album, they only just really came to light in the last couple of years. And for me, this is sort of jumping off topic, but for me it's always like Christmas to see a new photograph. I'm convinced that there are photographs out there that we'll still be discovering, sealed and squirreled away between the pages of books. 100 years from now, we'll still be finding new photographs of Titanic, including perhaps new interior photographs. So I'm always hopeful that new ones will show up. And when they do, it is like Christmas for me. I eat it with a spoon. And when these Kempster photos came to light a few years ago, that was a perfect example of that. It wasn't just one or two, it was this whole collection that just filled in this wonderful gap in Titanic's story. The whole thing, leaving Harlan and Wolff and sailing out on her trials. But the controversy, of course, is this dark smudge or spot on the hull, on the lower starboard bow of the ship. And let's talk first about what this smudge really is. And it's claimed in the documentary that this is an anomaly in the hull, that it's damage, that it's a weak point in the steel. Several things like that are mentioned. And to me, at first, I thought, it's above the waterline. What damaged it above the waterline before it left Harlan and Wolff? to me, it just looked like a reflection from perhaps the jetty sticking out on the shoreline there as the ship is going by. The hull was painted with black paint, which when fresh is very glossy. So I just thought that this was a reflection. Well, upon further examination and study, I looked at photographs of Titanic at Southampton. I could see that the very same sort of area ending at the same hull strake was darker, even the day after the ship pulled into the dock at Southampton. On April 4th, there's a photograph that was taken, and you can see that at that strake, it's darker below. And at that point, I realized, you know what? This isn't a reflection on the hull from any shoreline. This is clearly just retouched, fresh black paint. And if you look at that particular photograph, you can see many other areas farther aft that have blotchy, glossier parts, lighter parts, darker parts, different spots and splotches that are clearly retouched areas of paint, which is what they were doing in Belfast before the ship ever left on our trials. So as far as the nature of the spot, it's simply paint as far as I'm concerned. The second claim that's made is that this dark spot is the exact spot where the Titanic struck the iceberg, where the iceberg caused the damage. And I use the word exact in quotes because that's the word that's actually said in the documentary. And this surprised me when I heard that because, although yes, the spot is on the starboard bow of the ship, and that's generally where the iceberg struck, it's nowhere near where all the reported damage occurred. All of this was well below the waterline, and by the time you get back to boiler room number 6 and boiler room number 5, we have damage, visible damage reported by eyewitnesses that was only 2 feet above the floor plates of the boiler room. So we're nowhere near the waterline, much less above it, which is where this spot is. The only damage, the only effect that the iceberg had that we know of above the waterline was that despite the freezing cold night, a few portholes were open. People liked the fresh air, I guess, and some ice actually tumbled through open portholes into rooms, into staterooms and cabins, and of course the ice that tumbled onto the forward well deck. Aside from that, as far as structural damage, I'm not aware of any above the waterline or anywhere close to the waterline. Another claim is that this dark spot was caused by the smoldering coal fire in Bunker 10. That's really the easiest thing to disprove, really. Let's take the spot on the hull. Even though the photograph is angled quite a bit towards us, you can see the vertical ends of the plates that follow the frame lines on the hull. And the ends of those hull plates are always perfectly vertical. And you can look at the photograph and you can draw a line up the side of the hull and see where it intersects details above on the superstructure at the well deck. And then you can go to the aft extremity of this dark spot on the hull and you can draw a line up there and see where it intersects the windows. And from that, you can turn it sideways to a profile plan of the ship and you can plot exactly where this dark spot is. You can see exactly how it relates to bunker number 10, which had this smoldering coal fire in it. And you can see just how distant those two locations are. There is just no way that that spot on the hull could have any relation whatsoever to the coal fire that was happening in Bunker 10. A day or two after the documentary aired, Titanic, The New Evidence, CNN did a report about the coal fire, fire and ice. It was getting an awful lot of publicity. And a new photograph was posted in this CNN report that wasn't in the documentary. A well-known photograph of Titanic at the pier in Southampton at berth 44. And the camera zooms in on this spot on the hull, supposedly showing, again, a sharp delineation between a dark patch and a lighter spot. And here again, and it's outlined in a rectangle, look at this evidence. Here's this scar from the coal fire again, this weakened steel. And, all anybody has to do is increase the contrast on that photograph, and you can easily see that what you're seeing is just the end of one of the many coal barges that was tied up next to the starboard side of Titanic at the dock there. The last claim that I can, easily address refers to the claim that Titanic docked in Southampton with her port side to the quay, specifically and deliberately to hide this damage on the starboard side, to hide that damage from the public, which would be on the quay, And this is easily disproved because there are any number of photographs that show Olympic before and after Titanic docking with the bow facing southwest at the White Star Dock. So this was not an uncommon practice at all. Why has this new theory created such a commotion, so much attention? I think there's two reasons. Number one is that it is intriguing. You can spin a good yarn about it. It is, as I said, watchable television. It seems like a plausible theory, so it captures, a person's attention. It does seem new. It seems fresh. It seems different. How can we ever dredge up anything new about Titanic? And oh my goodness, here's this whole new thing. When you really delve into it deeply, I think all I've been able to, address is the photo analysis really, and some of that. But I think others can take issue with some of the other claims that are made in the documentary. But it was very enjoyable to watch. And the thing I loved the most about it, speaking of photography again, because I'm all about that, was the living stills that they did for this show. They took these numerous archival photographs, colorized them, dimensionalized them into 3D, added living, breathing people to the scenes, moved the camera, and it was absolutely breathtaking. And I can't help thinking, this is just a documentary for television. I'm sure there was a limited budget involved in producing this. And I just think, man, imagine taking the highest resolution photographs that exist, and with a real Hollywood budget, what you could do with this process to bring history to life. I was very impressed. When I first met Edwina, or Winnie as we soon called her, I was struck by her cheerfulness, her sense of humor. She was a real wag, a real kidder, and so full of life. And she had to have been, she was 100 when she died, so she had to have been about 86 when I met her. Full of energy, sense of humor, and just to think that she was 27 years old on Titanic, that was the thing that really blew my mind. And at that point there were maybe, 50 survivors still alive or something like that. And but they were mostly younger. When Winnie boarded Titanic on April 10th, she was there early enough that she told me that she was able to tour a little bit of first class and was able to walk around, and which kind of surprised me. I mean, that was the first time I'd ever heard, I think, that second-class passengers had the run of the ship until the ship sailed. That was a new idea to me. But I don't recall her giving me a lot of details or remembering too much, other than the fact that she just called it a floating palace. She said it was just so grand and so amazing, But her stateroom was in second class. She had to retreat from first class when it got close to sailing time, and her stateroom was way down on E deck aft on the starboard side. And she had two cabin mates, or would have, Initially, when they were at Southampton, one other roommate boarded and was also in the room with Winnie, and her name was Susan Weber. And I don't recall Winnie saying too much about Susan. I think they sort of had separate existences on the ship. Mostly Winnie talked about the second person who boarded at Queenstown. And her name was Nora Keene. She was a case. She, a little bit, to hear Winnie tell it, she was a little bit a large woman, shall we say. And with the Irish accent, she got on there at Ireland. And as soon as she got into the stateroom, she said, "Oh, glory be to God. This ship will never reach New York. I just know it won't. As I was getting off the tender, I dropped my prayer book and my rosary, and that's terrible luck. This ship, oh, no, no, no." She just went on. And Winnie, of course, could imitate her perfectly. And it was so amusing to hear. And she just tried to calm her down. You know, it's going to be all right. The ship, they say it's unsinkable. You don't have to worry about anything. "Oh, no, but I tried. You don't understand." So apparently this went on throughout the entire voyage. Susan Weber, quiet, doing her own thing, and Nora Keene always asking, you know, what was that? What was that? You know, something's going to happen. In spite of that, she said that, and she had crossed the Atlantic a few times before this, and she said that this particular trip was so wonderful. Everybody she spoke to, she said, seemed friendly. She said it was such a happy ship. And on Sunday, April 14th, they had the hymn sing in second class. And she joined in, and she loves to sing. I speak in the present tense. Of course, she's long gone now, but she was always singing to her dying day. And she went to this hymn singing and participated, I'm sure, very, very loudly and vocally. And after the hymn sing, a few hours later, she ran into, I believe, a steward who said, "Oh, you know, Miss Trout, were you at the hymn sing?" And she said, "Oh, yes, of course I was." And he said, "Wasn't it lovely? The singing was so loud and so wonderful." And he said, "You know, it just seems to me that the ship we're too happy to last long." And Winnie thought to herself, "Oh dear, there goes another. First, Miss Keene carrying on about how the ship will never reach New York. And now somebody saying, well, the ship is just too happy to last long." Winnie was always a very good sleeper. She told me that, you know, as soon as her head hits the pillow, she's asleep within 5 seconds, you know, which I find hard to believe, but that's basically what she said. And I always envied her because I'm kind of the opposite. My brain is always really going, and it takes me sometimes 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour to drift off to sleep. The cogs are just always turning. And she was just the opposite. So that night, April 14th, she went to bed, fell right asleep. And she said the thing that awakened her was the ceasing of the vibration of the ship's engines. You get so used to this vibration, and she was very far aft, as I mentioned earlier. And so, you know, her berth always going like this, and the noise. And that stopped, and that woke her up. And she went outside and made inquiries. You know, there's nothing to be worried about. The ship will be back going in no time. Somebody else said, you know, eventually that the ship had struck an iceberg. And we want put your life belts on. It's only a precautionary measure. She would repeat that over and over again throughout the years. You know, put your life belts on. It's only a precautionary measure. And she went back and she told her roommates what she had heard. And again, I don't remember much about Susan Weber, what part she played here, but Nora Keene hit the roof, of course. "Oh, what did I tell you? I told you something," you know. So in the process of getting dressed and trying to put on warm clothes to go up to the boat deck, Miss Keene insisted on putting on a corset first. And at this point, Winnie had had enough. And she pulled the corset away because she was saying, help me with the corset. "We don't have time for that." She pulled the corset away from Miss Keene and threw it all the way down this corridor after convincing Miss Keene that she didn't need a corset. And they bundled up and went their separate ways. I don't know what happened to Miss Keene after that. I know she was saved. But Winnie herself saved only her prayer book and a toothbrush. And went up toward the boat deck And on the way, I believe, she ran into somebody who said, well, what do you think of this? We've hit an iceberg. And Winnie said, I think it's a sad parting for us all and a watery grave. And I asked her, I said, well, why were you being so fatalistic? You were a female, you should have been able to get into a lifeboat, and that seems like, and she said, oh, I never expected to live. I really didn't. And I thought, well, why? You're traveling alone, it's just you, just get into a lifeboat. She said, well, the ship was so full of families and husbands and brothers and sons and sisters. And she said, I was alone. And I didn't feel that I had any right to take a place in a lifeboat when families were being separated. And I stood back and I fully expected to not be saved. And that was just the most amazing thing to hear somebody say that. But a man stepped forward who had a few kids and was holding a baby and said, I need somebody to save this baby. Will somebody save this baby? And basically held it out towards Winnie. And Winnie said, well, I'll save the baby. That gave her a reason to save herself. As they were rowing away from the ship, she said that the crewman in charge of her boat got everybody to sing, pull for the shore, sailor, pull for the shore. And she would break into song and she could sing that whole thing from start to finish, and she said, I've always remembered that because we sang it and sang it. And she said, when the ship sank, she said, the scream of death is worse than any siren. Those were her exact words. The yelling and screaming of all those people in the water affected her greatly. She had what she described as a nervous breakdown aboard Carpathia en route to New York. It all became too much. She described that there were several deaths on board from the survivors who had been too chilled and didn't make it. I'm not sure if that's technically true or not, but she does remember the burials at sea. Once she climbed up and got on board Carpathia, the baby that she had saved was reunited at some point with its mother, thankfully. And one of the first things that happened, some fellow survivor came up to her, who I guess she had met on Titanic or something, I don't know, and said, oh, what were you able to save? And Winnie said, well, I only have my toothbrush and my prayer book. And, oh, you didn't save any powder? Oh, well, you have to have some powder. Oh, dear. And she opened up her handkerchief, and opened it up where this other survivor had saved some face powder, which apparently was a big, important thing back then. And I think Winnie was a little bit amused by this, that, this was considered to be so, let me share some powder with you. But she spent the next several days sleeping in, I believe, one of the public rooms. But she became so upset at some point and so unnerved with this nervous thing that I believe, if I recall, she said that she was given a stateroom and was able to actually sleep in a bunk for the last day or two, maybe, of the voyage to New York. Winnie would often comment that Titanic made me what I am today. And this is why she, I guess, didn't feel as if she really had a purpose before Titanic. She had been a somewhat, not sickly, but she hadn't led a very eventual life, and she was single. She was 27 years old. She had not married. She had not met anyone. She was, and as I said, she was ready to face death on Titanic. She was quite religious. So having survived Titanic, she vowed then and there that I must be here for a reason. I was saved for a reason, and I need to take advantage of this opportunity. And she vowed then and there to be cheerful, not to complain, to do the best she could to help others throughout the rest of her life. And she did. She did. And in that sense, Titanic made her who she was for the rest of her life. Of all the Titanic survivors that I've had the good fortune to know, Ruth Becker Blanchard absolutely has to be right up there at the top. I feel so blessed to have known her, and to have known her rather intimately, actually, through the years until her death in 1990. Had 8 years of visiting her very often. And I can thank Don Lynch, actually, for introducing me to her. It was Don who actually sort of tracked her down in the late 70s and was corresponding with her a little bit by mail. And she didn't seem too interested in the Titanic topic. She was rather a cautious person, and she wondered why people were interested in trying to get in touch with you. You want to talk about Titanic? Why? And because of her seeming reticence, Don sort of backed off a little bit and didn't pursue her. But when Craig Wade wrote a book and interviewed her, or had quotes from her in the book, and that sparked Don's interest again to pursue her and see if maybe she really would, talk to us. And so he phoned her one day, and anyway, the long story short is that by the end of the conversation, she agreed that we could drive up. Don and I both lived in the Los Angeles area, and she was up in Santa Barbara, so she was only about 2 hours away, an hour and a half. She said, "You can come up and let's meet, and I'll maybe tell you my story." So, instantly we planned a trip to do that. She didn't understand why people would be interested in her. The Titanic was a long time in the past. It had sort of been a subject that was not discussed in her family. And so she was cautious about meeting Don Lynch and myself. And we took one or two other friends up with us to help sort of break the ice. Rusty Brown, who was an author, we took her with us because Rusty was a good friend of Edwina Mackenzie's. And we thought that would be good to have another female there to help kind of warm Ruth up, make her feel more comfortable. So it started off a little bit where she was cautious. Obviously, we were all strangers to her. But she warmed up, and once she knew that you were sincere and not pursuing her for some other reason, she accepted you. And as the years went by, we felt like family. We really did. Of course, the conversation eventually got around to her telling her story. And we were asking her, "So how did you end up on Titanic?" And she said that, her father, Alan O. Becker, was a United Lutheran missionary and had been over in India for a number of years. Actually, I think he was there as long as 13 years, if I recall. And Ruth actually was born in India, in Guntur, India, in 1899 on October 28th. And she and I share a birthday. And she's the oldest of 3 children that Alan and his wife Nellie had. The first child was named Luther. In 1907, he started to fall ill there in India and eventually died. And then Marion, she was 4 years old in 1912, and a young brother, Richard, who was 23 months old at the time. By early 1912, Richard had started to show signs of an illness as well, and his parents were not about to take another chance. They were all originally from the United States, from the Michigan area, actually. Alan was from Benton Harbor, Michigan. And when he started to get sick, they said, we're going back to the United States to get some proper treatment. Alan, the father, stayed there in India for his missionary work to complete that. Ruth's mother felt strong enough and capable enough to handle the 3 kids, Ruth, Marion, and Richard, to travel all the way to England, get on a ship, and get back to the United States. So they got on a ship called the City of Benares in Madras, India, sailed up through the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean, and up to London. It ended up in London there. And they had about a week in London, sort of a layover, if you will, before the ship left for New York, that ship being Titanic. And Ruth very well remembered visiting the zoo in London and seeing Madame Tussauds. And she always loved animals, so she got a big kick out of the zoo. And they took the boat train on April 10th and went to Southampton to board Titanic second class. And they were assigned stateroom 8 on F deck on the port side, way back aft, just above the engine. And Ruth's mother was none too pleased about being on the maiden voyage of the largest ship in the world. And she approached what Ruth described as the purser and asked, expressed her concerns about it and was reassured that, have nothing to worry about, madam. The ship has many, many watertight compartments. And should anything happen, and of course nothing will, the ship will be able to float indefinitely. So do not worry about it. So she felt, I guess, a little bit comforted by that. And once they were settled in the stateroom, it was a stateroom with four berths for the four of them. And Ruth started exploring. And even before the ship left Southampton, she noticed a few things. She noticed that there were still men up on the deck painting a few of the fixtures, perhaps a bit, a lifeboat, a davit launching bit that was in the boat deck. I'm not sure exactly what it was that she noticed, but she got the impression that the ship wasn't quite finished yet in some respects because of the painting and the touch-ups that seemed to be going on. And she looked in the windows and into the second-class dining saloon, and she always remembered all the glittering silverware and china and glassware and the crisp white linens. And she said everything was new, she said, just so new. The night of the collision, they were all in bed, asleep. And because they were located so close to the engines, right above them, just as with Edwina Mackenzie, they had become so used to the rumbling and the vibration and the sound of those engines. And that all stopped. They didn't feel the collision or anything like that, but they were awakened by the ceasing of the vibration of those engines. And Ruth's mother went out immediately to inquire what was going on. First person she spoke to, a steward, said, "Oh, it's nothing, madam. There's been just a little accident and we'll be on our way again in just a few minutes." But she wasn't quite satisfied with that, so she inquired further, and someone else told her it would be best if you put your life jackets on, dressed warmly, and get up on the boat deck to the lifeboats. Well, she went right back to the stateroom and told the news, woke up the kids. Ruth helped the kids dress. In the haste, they forgot the life belts, didn't put them on, and up they went to a public room up toward the top. Ruth couldn't remember which, but they waited for some time in a public room, a second-class room, for more directions. And then at some point, they were led outside, and they waited out there. And she said she watched the distress rockets going off. She didn't call them distress rockets. She just said, watch the fireworks. We quizzed her about that. I asked her, do you remember any color in those rockets? Because there's a controversy if they were all white or were they colored. I don't remember, but I watched 5 of them. She remembered 5 of all things. I watched 5 of them and counted them. And they were just like the 4th of July. But I don't remember if they were colored or not specifically. Well, it was freezing cold, and her mother finally said, "Ruth, go back down to the stateroom to get more blankets." So she did so, wended her way all the way back down, got the blankets. By the time she got back up, there was a commotion going on. Just immediately, get in the lifeboat. And an officer was directing her mother and her siblings to a lifeboat, which was boat 11, which was quite crowded. And there was just a lot of confusion at that moment. No panic, no screaming. She said, "I never remembered any of that like you see in some of the movies." It was calm, people were polite, but it was now, get in the boat. And the kids were handed into lifeboat 11, including Richard. And then the officer said, "That's it, no more for this boat." And Ruth's mother screamed out, "Oh, please let me go with my children." And the officer relented and allowed her to get in. But Ruth was still standing on the deck, holding these blankets. it had been so confusing, and she never had the chance to even hand the blankets out. So she was still holding these blankets. Ruth, she said, Ruth, go to the next boat and get in the next boat, because they were not letting any more in. It ended up being boat 13. They didn't know that at the time, but Ruth said, okay, and went down to the next boat and asked the officer there, may I get in? Sure. Picked her up and chucked her into the boat. Weren't you frightened? Weren't you scared? And she said, no. You know, I was never frightened. I was never scared through that whole thing. I was excited. She said, I just was excited. I knew that something important was happening, but I never thought the ship would sink. This was just some event, and we were getting in the lifeboat to row away from the ship for a while, and I wasn't scared. So like boat 11, which was so full that Ruth's mother had to stand throughout the entire night, boat 13 was the same way, very crowded. Ruth got in, she had to stand. She was one of the last ones in the boat. She had the sense that it was one of the last lifeboats being launched, and they started launching the boat. Down it went. She said it was very jerky. They would lower one end a little too steeply, and then the other end would come down a little steeply, and she said that was kind of exciting. But again, she didn't use the word scared. She just said that was exciting. And they reached the water, and it turns out that where lifeboat 13 came down was very near the condenser discharge of Titanic. Now, the condenser discharge is a huge rush of water being ejected from the side of the ship. And that point in the hull is right at the pivot point throughout most of the sinking. It was at the waterline before the ship ever struck the iceberg, and it was right at the waterline still when lifeboat 13 came down in the water. Just a little bit aft of that discharge, and the flow of that surging water, because the engines, the steam was still working and so forth, and the water was surging out. And Lawrence Beasley describes this exact same thing. He was also in lifeboat 13. And it sort of pushed boat 13 aft a little bit and made the davit falls more taut so that they couldn't release the blocks from the hooks, and they were kind of stuck to the davit falls. And they were yelling up, you know, nobody could hear because of noise. Well, here comes the next boat, boat 15. So they were all starting to yell up, stop lowering, we're right under here, we can't get the falls undone. The boat kept coming down until the men in boat 13, Ruth's boat, could actually touch the bottom of this boat. And here it comes. It would have landed right on top and perhaps, you know, swamped boat 13. Some crewmen pulled out a knife at the last minute and started cutting through these falls, about 1.5 inches in diameter. And that's how they were finally able to push away with oars and get away from the hull just before boat 15 came down right where 13 had been. So that was a close call. And there were stokers in her boat who were very scantily dressed because they had come up from the stokehold where it's very hot. So they were getting very cold very quickly. And Ruth suddenly realized she still had all these blankets she'd never given to her mom. So they immediately started, you know, spreading, passing these blankets out, and they tore them into strips to give to those who were most cold, including these stokers who were really, really cold. As they were rowing away, Ruth got her first good look at the ship from a distance. Because, you know, when you're on board, you're not aware of the danger. You get used to the angle of the deck slowly tipping more and more. And it wasn't until she was, you know, a ways away in the boat and she looked back, she saw the rows and rows of lights in the portholes, every deck blazing with light. She always talked about that. And the people lining the rails, all these heads and these bodies looking out. And she thought to herself, well, what's going to happen to them? Because I was in one of the last lifeboats. And so the wheels started turning. This maybe isn't just an exciting event. This may be a very catastrophic event. And the people in the boats, the stokers started talking about, you know, the ship's not going to make it, it's going to sink, and we need to get as far away from it as we possibly can because of the suction. She remembers the lights growing dim and dying out. That was her expression. The lights died out. And she described what sounded like a huge explosion and the ship splitting in two. She said we could see the funnels on one side going down, and the back part of the boat, she called it the boat, the back part went this way. And we all watched that. And then she said started the horrible sound of the screaming and the yells and the cries from all the people in the water freezing to death. She wasn't really sure what she was hearing. She knew it wasn't good, but for all she knew, they were people in the other boats yelling or what. You know, it was dark. Actually, she was told later on the Carpathia by someone who probably saw her as a child and was trying not to scare her and make her, you know, less frightened. It was explained to her, she brought up the subject of the cries and the screams in the water, and someone said to her on the Carpathia, oh, well, that was just all the steerage passengers. They were crying and yelling because they had lost their luggage, their baggage. Can you imagine? And I of course, Ruth didn't believe that. But that cry is something that the survivors never forgot. And she said what was almost worse was the silence that followed it. Eventually the cries died away and there was this dead silence. And the night went on and the dawn arrived, and they were one of the early boats to arrive at Carpathia to be picked up. She was hoisted aboard in a swing. So Ruth was safely aboard the rescue ship. She was reunited with her mother and her two siblings. And surprisingly enough, it turns out that this is the only example of a parent saving 3 children that entire night, the Becker family being lucky enough to survive. On the way to New York, Ruth's mother admonished Ruth not to tell anybody when we get to New York that we're survivors of the Titanic. We don't want the attention, we don't want the sympathy, we don't want the charity. Don't tell a soul. We're going to get on a train, we're going to Benton Harbor, Michigan, just as planned, to get treatment for Richard, and that's that. Ruth, of course, agreed. So they arrive at New York, they're on the train to Michigan. And what happens but somebody comes up and approaches Mrs. Becker and says, why, are you the survivors who were on Titanic? Oh, we're so sorry. Is there anything we can do for you? You must have been through, you know, the whole thing. Here comes the sympathy and everything. And Mrs. Becker handled it, you know, with aplomb and said, we're just fine, thank you, everything's okay. And the person went away. And she turned to Ruth privately immediately and said, I told you not to tell. And she scolded Ruth. And Ruth said, I don't remember telling anybody, I didn't do it. But this was an incident that really burned into Ruth's personality for the rest of her life. That it's not something to talk about. We don't want the charity, we don't want the attention. And she kept that throughout her entire life. She was reticent to tell anybody that they'd been on Titanic. So they arrived at Benton Harbor. Richard presumably was treated and cured. The family eventually moved to Worcester, Ohio, and Alan became a minister there, and I believe for a number of years. Ruth went to college there at Worcester College, and graduated and became a grade school teacher. And then they moved back to Benton Harbor. She married Daniel Blanchard in 1924. She and Daniel had 3 children. And during a period in the early 20s, she had learned how to play the piano, I guess, maybe perhaps even in India. I don't remember where, but she was quite proficient at the keyboard. And she actually played the theater organ during silent movies in a theater occasionally. Eventually, she moved to Santa Barbara. During our many visits with Ruth, driving up there and taking day drives with her, driving her down to Los Angeles for a while, and my grandmother knew her. I drove my grandmother up there to visit with her. As I said, she just became a family member. And as with Edwina Mackenzie, you seldom spoke of Titanic. You spoke about everything else, the news going on and other things, and Titanic would rarely come up. But when we did speak to her about that event, what was really special about Ruth, among many things, was the fact that she had not told her story repeatedly through the decades, as other survivors had. So when we would ask her a question about something, because she had not thought about this particular aspect or that particular aspect for all these years, she would have to sit there and think about it, and she would close her eyes and go, oh, no, I didn't do that. Oh, I remember. My mother did this, and then I went there. It was that kind of thing, and your mouth would just drop open because, you were hearing this as if she were describing something that happened last week. The memory was fresh. It just hadn't been tapped, in 70, 75 years. And a great example of that is in 1985, a friend, Tim Yoder, who also got to know Ruth very well in addition to our group in Los Angeles, invited Ruth and me to fly east to Ohio. He lived in Ohio, and sort of for an old home week. He said, I'll drive Ruth around. We'll go back to Worcester. We'll see the old haunts that she remembers from back in her college days. There was an old dear friend of hers, a female friend that Ruth hadn't seen in like 50 years. We'll arrange a reunion. Ruth called her Babe. That was her nickname for her. Way back to the 1920s, hadn't seen her in all this time. So this trip happened, and stayed with Tim at his home, did these little day trips to visit these places. And one night in Tim's living room, the subject of videotapes came up, or movies or something like that, and she mentioned that she hadn't seen A Night to Remember. So we watched the movie. Now you can imagine sitting next to somebody who was there, and not an infant, but 12 and a half years old and pretty observant for her age and very responsible, sitting next to somebody, the surreal experience of watching the movie and hearing this woman casually comment throughout the movie, oh, I remember those hats. Oh my goodness, yes. Or this or the other thing, When it came to some of the scenes of panic on the decks, she said, oh, I don't remember that at all. There, I didn't hear any screaming like that at all. And Tim and I would look at each other and we just kind of pinch ourselves, like, this is an amazing experience. I mean, what people would give to experience something like that, sitting next to a woman who had seen and experienced history like that through her own eyes. And the movie ended. We all went to bed. The next morning at breakfast, at Tim's breakfast table, we're eating, and all of a sudden Ruth says, oh, I should tell you something. This is the queerest thing. She said, as I was lying in bed last night trying to get to sleep after the movie, I was thinking and thinking, and she said, you know what I remembered? When my mother sent me back down to the stateroom to get those blankets, I never saw a single soul on that whole way down to the room or back up to the deck. Isn't that the strangest thing? A big ship like that with all those people. And I haven't thought about that in all these years. And again, Tim and I are in mid-bite having breakfast, and we're just, oh my goodness, she just thought of that for the first time, in 1985, 73 years. So, there were so many special moments with her. And just a small part of it is her amazing recall and her willingness to plumb back into her mind. Some other survivors would just say, oh, I don't remember that. That was too long ago. But Ruth would stop and she would actually think about it. And if she couldn't remember something, she'd say no. But she would close her eyes and she would picture things, and things would come back to her that was just amazing. Very shortly after we had met her, Don was speaking to her by phone early 1982 and mentioned to her that the 70th anniversary of the Titanic voyage sinking was coming up in April, and the Titanic Historical Society was going to be having a big convention on the East Coast, and several other survivors were going to be coming, including Edwina Mackenzie. And was she at all interested in coming? We really wanted to twist her arm and fly with her, escort her to a convention to help to kind of maybe bring her out of the shell a little bit. And her response was as she had always said in the past, which was just, oh no, I don't want to dwell on the Titanic, and I'm not a celebrity, and it's just not my thing. I don't want the attention, but thank you anyway. And Don said, okay, I understand. But at the end of the conversation, just before Don hung up, she said, oh, but Don, would you do me a favor? Oh, of course, he said. Would you let me know how it went after you get back? I'd love to know how it went. He said, of course I will. And as soon as he hung up, he told me about it, and he said, we're going to talk her into going. I think there's a crack in the door there. So one thing led to another. We were visiting her, driving up to her home in Santa Barbara, and her daughter, Jean, felt very comfortable with us, her Titanic boys, and helped to talk Ruth into, this would be an exciting, fun thing for you. You're able to get around. You're perfectly healthy. Why in the world don't you want to go to this thing? You can meet some other survivors. The boys will take very good care of you. So she relented, and she agreed to go. And the convention went off without a hitch. It was great. She ended up on camera, being interviewed by the news media. And in fact, there was one press conference there that was held, and where the survivors, I believe there were a total of 5 survivors at that convention. And they were all telling their stories and things. And it came to Ruth, and Ruth told her tale. And it got to the part where she said, and we were in the lifeboat, and we watched, and it looked to us like the ship broke in two. We could see the funnels going this way, and then the back part of the boat went that way, and we were all talking about it, a very loud noise. Well, she could hardly get these words out, and somebody in the audience, there's all the news cameras in the back, and then his other audience members of the Titanic Historical Society. One person who was a representative of the Titanic Historical Society started going like this and shaking his hands like this as she was talking about the ship sinking. And my friends and I were looking at each other, what's that guy, what's wrong? And Ruth stopped talking, and he finally, I think, stood up and actually turned to the media, turned to the cameras and said, I just want to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say that this is not the official position of the Titanic Historical Society. According to historians, the ship did not break in two. It sank in one piece. This was 1982, before the wreck was found. And I was mortified. I just thought, how could anybody do that? He sat back down, and Ruth just sat there for a moment, and then she said in pretty much these words, she leaned into the microphone and said, well, that's what it looked like to me. So much as to say, I was there and you weren't. She said, we were talking about it in the lifeboat, and the ship broke in two. I stand by that. Not in those words exactly. I'm sure it's on tape someplace. I would love to see a recording of that incident. But that was great to see her stand her ground, and she was certain that the ship had broken in two. And I kind of thought they must be mistaken myself. I mean, I'd studied Titanic since I was in high school. The official inquiries established that the ship, sank in one piece. Charles Lightoller, second officer of the Titanic, insisted, she went down in one piece. So the general consensus is that the ship was brand new and very, very strong, and of course it went down in one piece. And yet there were a number of survivors, a lot of them, which when you go back and actually look at the accounts, described that they thought the ship broke in two. And the inquiries, the American inquiry and the British inquiry, tended to just gloss over all those eyewitness accounts and ended up basically dropping the gavel and saying, well, the ship sank in one piece. And that was the official line through all of these years, which I don't think Ruth had even heard of the official results of any inquiries or anything like that. She just always remembered that, as the ship was sinking and the lights died out, the ship broke in two, and we watched it. Aside from a brief ferry trip from Miami to Nassau at one point in her life, and a voyage across to Santa Catalina Island from Los Angeles aboard the SS Catalina, and that's just a 2-hour trip on basically another ferry. Aside from those 2 voyages, she had never been to sea again since she stepped off of Carpathia. And as the 80s wore on, we got the idea we should go on a cruise. We should go on a cruise with Ruth. We've got to get her to go. And that eventually happened in March of 1990. And there was a group of us, Titanic boys, that went along with her and her daughter Jean. And we took the Fair Princess on a Mexican Riviera cruise from Los Angeles down to Cabo San Lucas and Mazatlan and maybe Puerto Vallarta and then back to LA. Before the Fair Princess left the dock in Los Angeles, we had the usual lifeboat drill. Mustered to the deck, standing next to the lifeboat and so forth. Everybody bundled up in their big bright orange life jackets. And here was Ruth and her daughter Jean and the group of us. And we're getting the lecture from the officer. And Ruth at one point turned to us and said, we didn't do anything like this on the Titanic. And several heads turned and looked, and then people whispered and spoke to other people, and more heads turned, It was just like, nobody could possibly be saying this. It must be a joke. That was a great cruise. We had a good time, great companionship, great camaraderie at the dinner table. Although she didn't want the word to get out that she was a Titanic survivor, not because she was ashamed of it or that it was difficult for her to talk about it or anything like that, but she still just wasn't really comfortable being a celebrity. She just didn't seek the limelight, period. But somehow or another, the word gets around. And so people would approach her now and then and say, I heard that you're so, meeting the captain at the captain's cocktail party, the captain said, Mrs. Blanchard, thank you for trusting me on the ship. I appreciate that. And Shirley Jones and her husband, Marty Ingalls, the actress and singer Shirley Jones, was on board. And Ruth remembered her. She was there, I should say, she was there for some Q&A sessions and perhaps to sing a little bit, although I don't remember her singing on board. I think it was more like just a meet and greet type of thing. But Ruth, of course, knew of Shirley Jones. She particularly loved her performance in Oklahoma. And so we spoke to Shirley and asked her if she would like to meet Ruth. Oh, I've heard there's a Titanic survivor on board, and I would love to meet her. So that was arranged. And one evening after dinner, Shirley Jones came to Ruth's and Jean's stateroom on the ship, and they had a little visit. I took a photograph of them. And just before the end of the cruise, Ruth was approached by a gentleman who asked if she was the survivor that was on Titanic, and she said yes. And he said, well, I've written a book about the Titanic. Oh, really? Well, it turned out it was Clive Cussler, who had written Raise the Titanic, which is a big hit. Big book in the late 70s, a big hit. And I worked on that movie in the 1977 and 78, worked on the miniatures for that film. So there was kind of a tie-in there. That was my first meeting with Clive Cussler. I had spoken to him on the phone before that because he and a Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution scientist and I were guests on Nightline with Ted Koppel just a couple of days after Titanic was first discovered. So I had spoken to Clive Cussler just during that little interview on ABC, but this was the first time I got to actually meet him. And it was just as we were arriving back at Los Angeles where we were able to get together and chat a little bit. So that was a highlight for me. She expressed how grateful she was in her later years for the new friendships that Titanic had brought her and the new adventures. She ended up going to 3 Titanic Historical Society conventions, 1982, 87, and 88. And I think in 87 or maybe 88, we had the largest reunion of survivors since the premiere of A Night to Remember in 1958. There were 10 or more. And she was one of them. And she grew to enjoy them. But she did say that she always felt a little guilty for the joy and the benefits that she was getting from this horrible disaster, the new friendships and so forth that she was getting at the expense of, in a way, and that she didn't, deserve this necessarily. So it kind of bothered her a little bit that out of such terrible catastrophe, she was enjoying so many wonderful benefits in her last years.